Live stream audio test, 1, 2. It is now past. The inquiry is resumed. Have you had a chance to look at that document now, Mr. Etchell? Excellent. Unless there's any reason why not, can we continue with cross-examination, please? Not that we've really started. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed. Mr. Etchells, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Etchells, I'm going to start with three things that pick up from your evidence in chief, and then we'll move on to the matters which I was intending to cover in any event. Just the first is where you finished, in fact, just for nailing the point down. Do you remember you observed to learn friend in terms of the contrast between the design aspects of the scheme and the landscape impact as a matter of development within the landscape, that you made it clear that as far as you're concerned on behalf of the council, you're not taking a design objection to the scheme. As you put it, there's no issues with the design. It's the presence of the development in the landscape the council finds objection.
Yes, the council has made no objection to the way in which the development is laid out within the site. Other than, I suppose, the points I made about the view cones, which
yes,
I don't necessarily agree will perform in the way they're intended. But otherwise, as I understand it, the council takes no exception to the design
very helpful.
As such.
And neither do you as a professional witness?
No.
Good. So the inspector can park then, as far as the authority is concerned. Others may have a different view as far as the authority is concerned. The issues which one finds within the MPPF as it's now drafted in terms of placemaking and beauty and all these things, we're dealing with a landscape character and a landscape visual impact. Yes,
it's still my view and the council's view that the development isn't appropriate in this place, but in itself, we have no comments on the design, effectively, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And indeed, if you turn up your proof, you helpfully set out the reason for refusal at your paragraph 2.1.7. Do you have that?
I do, yes.
And if we just unpack it a little bit, we can see that the allegation is in the first sentence. It's by reason of its location, ... and its scale, ... prominent in some local views, and as a result of these, would be out of keeping with the overall character of the village and landscape setting.
Yes.
So again, it's not a design issue, it's a locational, and I suppose at this point, scale issue in this location.
Yep.
Yep. That's very helpful. Thank you. Second matter, just to pick up in chief, do you remember on a number of occasions, and indeed you touched on it in terms of design, view cones too, you talked about the potential of the paddock, which is, as it were, embraced by the L of the scheme, the potential of the paddock coming forward for development at a later stage, and the scheme facilitates that with a suggested hammerhead in the illustrative layout.
Yes, I'm not sure it's a hammerhead, but it shows two potential points of access and actually sketches in the form of development.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, you appreciate for the purpose of our inspection and our appeal, there is no such scheme before the inspector developing that paddock.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And equally, therefore, for the purpose of our inspector on our appeal, he must assess the scheme which is before him, which doesn't include development of that paddock. Yes?
Well, it doesn't include it, but it would appear to be designed to facilitate it.
Facilitate is different from propose, yes? And it's not before the inspector.
It's not part of the current proposals.
That's very helpful. And indeed, the points you make about, well, development of it may close off carefully designed view cones might be valid, and indeed might be an objection to such a scheme were it to come forward in the future on that paddock. But that's not before our inspector.
No, it's not, no. I mean, my view is that it might be difficult to refuse an application for development on that paddock if this application succeeds and is built out. But that is a matter for the future.
I'm grateful. You've actually already given us a good reason, haven't you? Which is, if view cones are seen to be important, and this then blocks some of the important view cones preserved by the scheme that is before the inspector, then that may very well lead to a refusal of any subsequent scheme.
It may do, although in my opinion the view cone would already have been compromised by this appeal.
That's a different point. I'm talking about additional blocking by an as yet inchoate scheme, not before our inspector.
Yes. That's grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The third point is how we're to treat the Wardle-Armstrong document. You appreciate it's a published document, but not one that's been consulted upon, as I understand it.
As I understand it, yes.
Yeah. And of course, I don't have the pleasure of cross-examining Mr. Ward or Mr. Armstrong. I've only got you here. But we see what it says in terms of the notation on the map. And you've now got the two extracts, one from the methodology, one from section 4, forgive me, 3 extracts, and one from the chapter on Wrington itself.
Yep.
Can you just take those up for me, please? And as you do so, would you mind turning up the inspector's decision in Rectory Farm, which is, I don't know how you may have it, but it's certainly CD J22. I have it separately.
Can I just ask about that? I don't have it electronically. I think I've got it a paper version. Is there a reason why it's not in? Certainly not online, and it's not in my pins.
All I noticed, though, was that the CD list said to follow. So whether it wasn't.
Ah.
There we are. Mr. Coombs can help.
We were expecting the bill to come after the CD listing was fixed, so it's listed in the documents. It was circulated electronically at some point, but maybe in batch documents.
Oh well, I've no doubt I've got it somewhere, and I don't know whether it's in here now. I'm beginning to doubt it. But the first thing that came to mind was certainly when I looked over lunch, there wasn't the link to it on the council's website. So if that could be addressed, so that people can follow along at home, that would be helpful. Let me just check. I think I've got it.
If you don't
have it,
would be
so
handy
yes, if I could have it, please.
Because we'll go to it for a number of different reasons. Mr. Etchells, do you have that
I do, yes.
decision?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm grateful. Now, if you take up the plan, first of all, so we can see Wrington, and we can see the pale pink, which is the high notation, and you see the word butts batch, I hope, palely under that.
Yes.
Yep. And then at the same time, take up the section on Wrington, which is an extract from section 6, and as you rightly took my learned friend to it, it's paragraph 63100. You got that?
Yes.
And it's done a compass tour, hasn't it? North, east, south, and then it turns to west. West is 6,300. And we can see the text, I hope. To the west of the village, the land is open, visually prominent, and located outside settlement form. No landscape features which could potentially limit development sprawl. And then owing to this, presumably we're to read that as owing to each and all of those things added together. Yeah?
Yes.
Owing to this, this land is of high sensitivity.
Yep.
Yep. First thing we can say, can't we, is we look to the map and to the land to the west. It extends to a greater extent than does the appeal site before the inspector.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. It extends both north and east, forgive me, north and west of the appeal site, that pink notation.
Yes.
Yes. And so the observations being made, the land to the west of the village is ... we're to assume is to apply to all of that area there marked.
Yes, as you say, they've done it by compass point, so that paragraph, I imagine, would refer to all of the land to the west.
That's helpful.
Although there is a small area to the northwest, which is medium sensitivity, but in general it's high.
Yes, that's separately dealt with in terms of paragraph 6.301, isn't it? Those two small parcels south of the West Hay Road.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And then, just as a matter of detail, we can say the reference to no landscape features which could potentially limit development sprawl. You're aware, perhaps more from the heritage evidence than the landscape evidence, that the proposal is to reintroduce lost landscape features in terms of former hedgerows as part of the landscaping on the western and southern side of the scheme.
I can see from the landscape plan there is a proposed hedgerow there, and I understand it is along the line of a hedgerow which was previously
Formerly there, I agree.
But clearly the Wardell Armstrong assessment is talking about what's there at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, they're not assessing an individual proposal, are they? As we just indicated, they're actually assessing the land all the way around Wrington.
Yes.
And in this instance, all of the land to the west of Wrington.
Yes.
Yep. But for our purposes, inspector's purposes, he is assessing the scheme before him, and that does indeed introduce a, quote, landscape feature that would limit the development to the east and to the south. Western zone?
Well, not an existing landscape
No,
feature.
proposed as part of the scheme.
Yes, but it's not there at the moment, so it's not limiting the visibility of the development at the moment, and when it's planted, it would have very limited effect.
Well, that's a matter of judgment. But in terms of the proposal is to limit development along the line of a previous field boundary, which Ward Lonsdale may not even have known about, but certainly didn't see because it wasn't there.
The proposal is to reinstate a previous landscape feature, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, just put that extract to one side. So we note the issues of visually prominent, open, visually prominent, located outside settlement development form. But put that extract to one side and take up, please, the two other extracts, the methodology and the guidance, sections 4 and section 5. If one goes to section 5 first, can you see at 5.2.19, level sensitivity can be attributed to the following?
Yes.
Yeah. Now that's the, as it were, the output, high sensitivity. This land has generally low capacity. If it was developed, it could result in substantial harm. Yeah, that's the output. But to understand what the level sensitivity are assessed as meaning, if you look to the guidance, you take that up for me, please. Section 4, 4.1.13. The way high sensitivity is arrived at is looking at susceptibility and value, yes? And high sensitivity, are you with me for 113?
Yes.
High sensitivity is high susceptibility and or high value, e.g. land adjacent to or visually prominent from the AONB, land outside settlement pattern, land which has high visual prominence, land which contributes to heritage or ecological assets. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when one looks at the findings in section 6, we can see that there's no allegation, even for the wider area of land here covered, of the AONB point,
No.
or ecological, or indeed, you may differ from this, no reference to heritage either.
There is, well, in paragraph 6.3.100, there is no specific reference to heritage.
No, thank you very much. So, in terms of how one arrives at high sensitivity for the notation, it's the outside settlement pattern and high visual prominence.
Well,
according to Ward Armstrong, that's the point.
Well, what I would say, though, is in the main text of paragraph 4.1.13, it does say the following provides examples of the approach taken. It doesn't say the following is an exhaustive list.
No, I totally accept that, but that list is longer than the list we find at 6.3.100, isn't it? Yes?
Yes, it's got other things in it, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, we can also, if you take your eye down to the bottom of the page, see the context of this. And we know this was done to support the emerging, or the then emerging local plan. Paragraph 4.1.15, the assessment was undertaken at a strategic level. Do you see that?
I do.
And it should be noted that land will be categorized as being of high sensitivity to housing, where there will inevitably be variations in the level of landscape impacts, and also such variations could be determined further by more detailed survey at site or field level. And that obviously must be right if the authors are telling us that.
Yes, I would agree with that. This is it does say it's a strategic level, but I think that's because it's looking at land over the whole of the council area. It would obviously be possible to look at it in more detail than this assessment, but what I would say is that this assessment isn't very general. It has actually looked at quite small-scale areas. If we go back to the plan, it has identified individual fields as of different levels of sensitivity.
But the authors themselves are giving us this health warning, aren't they? Which is that there is within the indication of high, inevitably variations, level of impacts, and this could be determined further by more detailed survey at site or field level. You'll say, of course, that you and Mr. Lee have done that for the appellants and for the authority.
Yes, I'm not sure it's saying that there's inevitably variations in the level of sensitivity. What it says is there will inevitably be variations in the level of landscape impact.
Yes, and one of the inputs into an impact is going to be sensitivity, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. And then we can echo that through, if you go back to section 5 again, 5.2.15 this time, on page 21. Do you have that?
Yes.
Yeah. Assessment sheets identified the presence, what is present within the landscape, and were used to determine in broad terms the sensitivity of the landscape surrounding settlements based on, and then the criteria. Yeah. So again,
Yes.
the authors themselves alerting anyone reading this that it's in broad terms these judgments are made, then noted on the plan for the strategic purpose, and as we've seen, inevitable variations at a more detailed level. So that's what the authors themselves tell us. In terms of how it's then been used, do you have Mr. Marsh's rebuttal proof to hand at all?
Yes.
And if you could just take up again the Wrington map from this document. Do you have that?
I do.
And then take up the last page, I think it is, the appendix of Mr. Marsh's rebuttal.
Yes.
Which is, if you turn it sideways, you'll see the heading North Somerset Draft Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, January 2022.
Yes.
You see that?
Even I've got my glasses on, I'm struggling to read it.
Well, that's the trouble. You then need, it's a very small print, but that I hope you recognise as the village of Wrington in the map. Now, to be fair to you, the appeal site is marked an unhappy orange, discounted following assessment, yeah? But do you see areas on the right-hand side, that is the eastern side of the map, if you hold it horizontally?
Yeah, the blue ones.
That's it. And then you compare that, I hope, with the Wrington map from the Wardle Armstrong document. You see that?
Yes.
And site identified as having potential for consideration is the blue notation.
Yep.
And we can see the council has done that in this document in excess of the areas marked purple, which is medium sensitivity, and into the areas marked pink, which is high sensitivity.
Yes,
Yeah.
as far as I can see, the majority of the area of the northern part, which is identified as having potential for consideration, is shown by Wardle Armstrong as either medium or low sensitivity, but it does go slightly outside it.
I'm going to skate past your qualitative comments because the inspector will see for himself the lobe that sits over the word Wrington. And then there is, of course, the other parcel below that, the sort of L-shaped parcel, which is entirely in the pink.
There is, yes.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what the area that encloses is. I don't know.
But it's in the pink of Wardle Armstrong, yes?
It is in the pink.
So if the inspector wants to know the proof of the pudding in terms of how the Wardle Armstrong is being used for the document, the emerging local plan, plainly it's a factor, but it's not a determining factor. Yes?
Yes, and I think that would be the correct way to use it.
And then lastly on that, if we can take up the Rectory Farm decision. You have that? And it's the inspector's fourth issue, which starts at paragraph 93. Are you there?
Yes.
Grateful effect on the character and appearance of the area. And if you could turn to paragraph 99, you see he references the fact that the council relies, he says, heavily on the North Somerset Landscape Sensitivity Assessment 2018. And then he makes the following observations. This document has not been consulted on externally. That remains the case, as we understand it.
Yes, you probably need to ask somebody from the council, but my only knowledge of that is what I've seen written here, but I assume that's correct.
Thank you. And should be tempered on that basis. That's a perfectly proper approach, isn't it, for an inspector to take to a non-consulted upon document?
Yes, I think so, yes.
It is a high-level assessment. We've just seen references to that. And on a more granular analysis, it was agreed that when looking at individual areas of land, there would be variations. Indeed, we've seen the text of the authors themselves referring to the inevitable variations.
Yes, I agree. But the only thing I would say about that is there is a reasonable level of detail within the assessment.
We've seen that.
Sometimes you get an entire landscape character area is given an overall sensitivity, even though the character area may be quite large. In this case, Wardle Armstrong, even though they haven't gone down to the individual site level, they have gone into it to a fair level of detail.
I recognise that, Mr. Etchells, but equally you recognise the force of the point I'm putting to you, namely the document authors themselves recognise inevitable variation when you get to a more granular level.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. I'm grateful. Thank you very much. You can put that document away for the time being. And indeed, just finishing on this, as I understand it, although you may have a difference of professional view as to the degree of influence, you don't doubt, do you, that the adjacent settlement edge has a landscape influence in terms of the character of the site and its sensitivity?
It's clearly part of the local landscape character. It needs to be borne in mind, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Right, those are, I say, three stray matters I wanted to pick up from the Reverend Chief. Can we start where I would ordinarily start, please, in matters of policy? So, first of all, the MPPF, please. You'll be very familiar, paragraph 174.
Yep.
Yeah, and it divides landscapes that we're familiar with, for our purposes, into valued landscapes subject to paragraph 174A and others subject to 174B.
Yes.
I'm grateful. And A, valued landscapes, are to be protected and enhanced in a manner commensurate to their statutory status or identified quality in the development plan.
Yep.
And B is a different test, isn't it? The intrinsic character and beauty is to be recognised and ...
Yes, although I do make the comment in my evidence that in order for there to be any point in recognising it, that does imply that there's going to be some degree of protection, otherwise there'd be no point in recognising
Harm is recognised as a negative and goes onto the negative side of the balance, yes?
Yes.
But we're not given a test of protecting and enhancing something which is not a valued landscape.
No.
I'm grateful. And you'll be familiar with the fact that the core strategy here predates the NPPF. It's 2017, so it predates even the first version of the NPPF. And it does not make a recognition, does it, of this distinction between what are quotes valued landscapes and the policy tests to be applied to that, and those which are not quotes valued landscapes for 174A purposes.
Yes, it predates the July 2018 version of the MPPF.
Yeah. And it therefore does not make that recognition, the distinction between valued
Yes.
and not valued.
Yeah.
I'm always careful with the wording because I don't want to suggest there isn't a value to the landscape. I'm using the term of art, as you understand it, valued landscape for paragraph 174A purposes.
Yes, clearly, if something isn't a valued landscape, it doesn't mean it has no value.
No, quite. But there is a different policy test approach now taken in the NPPF.
Yes.
Yeah, good. I'm grateful. And the result, of course, being, and I know you're not a planner, but you'll be familiar with this concept, that a policy which continues to have a protect and enhance test for a, quotes, non-valued landscape, a not valued landscape, would be in conflict with the NPPF as we currently have it.
Well, I'm not a planner, but yes, given that the NPPF only says protect and enhance for valued landscapes,
So that's
that would follow.
do you have then the your proof? We had it open at 217 and the reason for refusal, just for convenience. And you see there's a set of policies said to be breached by reason 2, and obviously I'm only dealing with reason 2 for you.
I do.
And we can take up CS, the core strategy, if you don't mind. It's CD A1.
Yeah, I have the policies in my evidence. Do you want to go to anything?
Wherever is most convenient for you.
Okay.
The advantage of going to the main document is you get the supporting text too, but wherever it is convenient. I'm going to go to CS5, which is the first on the list in the reason for refusal.
Yep.
And first of all, we'll see that CS5, unsurprisingly, doesn't anticipate the division between, quotes, valued and not valued landscapes. And what it has in its second line is the test of protecting and enhancing.
It does, yes.
And that's supported at paragraph 376, the first paragraph of the supporting text, need to protect and enhance landscape, ...
Yes. Yep.
So we can agree in terms of the test CS5 sets, it's in conflict with the MPPF's approach.
Well, again, I'll caveat my answer by saying I'm not a planner, but what you've just said makes sense to me.
I'm grateful. Thank you. When we go on to the next policy cited in your reason for refusal, that is the reason that you speak to, CS32, do you have that?
I do, yes.
Service villages. First bullet point, form, design, scale development, high quality, and respects and enhances local character. Yeah?
Yep, same point.
Thank you very much. Now, the DM policies, there are two cited. They're in the next core document, A2. Do you have that?
Well, again, I've got them in my evidence, the text of the policies.
And DM10, first of all. Now, if we remember the date of this, it's adopted July 2016.
Yep.
DM10, first bullet point, is to not have an unacceptable adverse impact. Yeah?
Yep.
Necessarily importing the idea that there is such a thing as an acceptable adverse impact.
Yes, by implication, it does mean that some degree of impact could be acceptable.
Good. And indeed, if you look to the bottom of the page, the paragraph, where some harm to local landscape character is unavoidable, ... So again, importing the notion that you can have acceptable landscape impact and then seek to mitigate it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's right, isn't it, that certainly the way in which the glyphia is structured, when one reads a greenfield site turning into a developed site, in this case for housing proposal, that's going to register, at least at the site level, an adverse character impact because of the way it's changing greenfield countryside into urban form.
Yes, because the landscape would be taken up by built development, which in landscape terms is inherently harmful.
I'm grateful. And so if you're going to have greenfield development extending existing urban areas, you're going to inevitably have some degree of localized landscape character harm, aren't you?
Yes, and I think the policy recognises that. To say that you can never have any degree of harm whatsoever would be probably unrealistic.
That's very helpful. And the same obviously applies to visual matters. Obviously, if you're moving, as it were, the settlement boundary from where it currently is, settlement edge to where it currently is to where it's proposed to be, there will be views which will have altered from the former settlement edge, formerly looking out onto fields, but now looking out onto a housing estate.
Yes, it's normally the case with a development on the edge of the settlement that there would be some adverse effects for the houses which are at the moment on the edge. Yeah.
I'm grateful. And again, inevitably that would follow, and if that were to be a sufficient reason for withholding permission, you wouldn't be able to extend the settlement edge as expected.
It would be very difficult in most cases, yes.
Yeah, I'm grateful. And we didn't look in detail, we'll look at it with the planners, but policy CS32, which we touched on a moment ago, is indeed envisaging development both within and outside settlement boundaries of the relevant villages.
Yes, up to a certain level.
Well, we'll come to that in a second, but the principle of stepping outside the adopted settlement boundary is something envisaged by CS32.
Well, it says that, yes, it does, yes.
Yeah, I'm grateful. And so those 2 points that we've just agreed, that they will inevitably bring with them some localized landscape harm and visual harm, that has to be read into the acceptability of the stepping outside the settlement boundaries.
It would be a very unusual development on a greenfield site that led to no harm in those respects, yes, but the harm clearly varies a lot according to the precise nature of the site and the land that would be taken up by the development.
The last development plan policy listed in the reason for refusal is DM32. And you'll find that on page 76 of this document. Do you have that?
Yes.
And if you just scan your eye through it, it's a long policy with many bullet points. This is a design policy, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And as we clarified at the very beginning of cross-examination, there isn't a design point taken by the authority.
Well, except that the policy does include sensitivity to local landscape character, which I think can be offended not by the design in terms of layout, but by the proposal in terms of where it is.
But that's your first point, isn't it? Which is there is a landscape, an unacceptable landscape impact, not as a result of the design, but as a result of this scale in this location.
Yes, the paragraph I'm looking at says the design and planning of development proposals should demonstrate sensitivity. I think my view would be that maybe the planning of this development doesn't demonstrate sensitivity because it's planned in the wrong area.
Well, it depends how you read the word planning, but what your point simply is, location and scale here is unacceptable landscape harm. It's not that there's something arising from the manifestation of the design which will come through at reserve matters, or anything in the design access statement in terms of how that reserve matters application is to be framed.
Yes, other than the point I made about the view counts.
Yeah, grateful. Thank you very much. You can put those two core documents away then, please. Statement of common ground, please. That's the main statement of common ground with the authority and the appellant.
Yes.
And it probably is a core document, but I don't have a reference for it. The inspector may have it separately. And we go, please, there's a landscape section under reason 2. It starts at 632. Do you have that?
Yes.
I'm grateful. Because obviously the reason why we spend some time looking at policy tests for valued and for not valued landscape is what we find at 635, which is, it's agreed, isn't it, between the parties that the site is not sitting within a, quotes, valued landscape for the purpose of 174A.
Yes, it is. It's written down here. I say it in my evidence as well, yes.
That's right. And indeed, you'll have seen Mr. Lee's appended exercise using the up-to-date institute guidance, step by step, achieving the same result.
Yes, that's not the way I would approach it, but I agree with the result.
The conclusion is agreed. I'm grateful. Thank you very much. And so we're not in 174A, we're in 174B, and the test we've just seen in CS5 is not the test which the MPPF now sets our inspector.
Yes, in terms of enhance, obviously it still needs to be protected from harm.
Well, it needs to be taken into account, doesn't it? Harm needs to be taken into account.
It needs to be recognised, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Grateful. Thank you. The next matter, please, then, is in terms of the methodology which has been used before the inspector. At 633, we see that you've agreed the methodology of the LVA. I know you have different conclusions in terms of the output as a matter of professional judgment, but in terms of the methodology, you have no objections.
Yes, the methodology follows, in general terms, of GLVIA, and it sets out, is set out in a logical manner. But yes, as you say, I do disagree with some of the findings.
Yeah, as of course will be the case between two professional witnesses, perhaps. But in terms of the methodology, that's agreed. And indeed, within the methodology, as in terms of its application, landscape receptors are agreed, 634, and also visual receptors are agreed at 637.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm grateful. Yeah. And it's on that basis, isn't it, that we've been able to put together these blue sheets. Do you have that? Hopefully will aid us in speeding things on. It was anticipated at 6:38, it's now been done, and as I understand it, the contents are now agreed between you and Mr. Lee.
Yes, there's obviously divergence in the findings, but the contents of the table are agreed, yeah.
That was the point of the table, is to bring on to two sheets the divergent findings. Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, let's, with that in mind, look at certain aspects, please. In terms of landscape character, say I don't know which order you have them, but my first sheet is the one with lots of small writing on for landscape character. Yeah?
Yes.
If one looks to the left-hand side, we have landscape features within and around the site. This is the first box.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the next one is the one I'm going to focus on, which is the site and the environs. Yeah? Because you and I are both going to readily agree that within the site itself and its landscape features, we're going to record a negative by turning the green field into a housing estate. Yeah?
Yes.
And that, for all the reasons we've rehearsed in front of the inspector, can't in and of itself be objectionable, or else we'd never have a greenfield development approved. So we need to see how it sits within the landscape. And so we have the heading site and its environs. And then if we look to B is sensitivity, C is magnitude, and D is effect. And I won't bore the inspector, he's extremely familiar with all of this. The process is you assess the sensitivity of the site by reference to value susceptibility. You then assess its magnitude. You then apply the two together to give the effects. And within the methodology are the various matrices that allow you to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm grateful. And we have construction. I never paid attention to construction, but we have year 1 and year 2. Year 1 and year 15, the two further columns and landscape effects.
Yes.
Good. If one goes down the page for year 1 and year 15, once we've left the site and its environs, we find, don't we, slight or moderate or negligible or not considered.
Yes, and that is largely a product of the scale at which the effect is judged.
Yes,
because
because
as I said in chief, the River Yea Rolling Valley farmland landscape character area is very large, and the national character area is even larger. So virtually any development at the scale of the national character area would not have any significant effects.
Absolutely right. As your receptor gets bigger, the impact gets relatively smaller. So that's why I'm focusing on the second row, which is the site and its environs, and as you've described there, or it's been agreed between you, it's your figure 3, that's a purpley area within figure 3, within your appendix. If we then look to year 1 and year 15 for that, we have moderate to high for year 1. This is your row.
Yep.
And moderate adverse in year 15.
Yes.
So we've declined over time, and if we were to go back into our evidence, we would see the reason for that, decline in impact, reason for that is increasingly mature landscaping.
Yes, the landscape proposals would have some effect in terms of mitigating the visibility and presence of the development within the local landscape. Yeah.
And indeed, I don't think we need to turn them up given the answer you've given me, but we can perhaps see that through the visualizations year 1, year 15. But the point is you've recorded here, you go from a moderate to high reading, down to a moderate reading by year 15.
Yes, in my view, the moderate adverse effects in year 15 would still be significant, though.
Well, we'll come to that in a second. Obviously, matters have to be weighed by planners in due course. But that's the finding that you've recorded.
Yes.
Yeah, and the consequence of it, the consequence of the landscaping is to achieve that. Now, if we see the difference that reads through, in terms of sensitivity, we go medium-high. Sorry, forgive me. In terms of sensitivity, we go value medium-high, susceptibility to change high, and that leads, again, with the combination of those, to a high sensitivity.
Yeah, on the line for my assessment.
On your line, that's
yes.
right. In contrast to medium, leading to medium on Mr. Lay's.
I think Mr. Lee actually says low to medium sensitivity in his evidence, in contrast to what the LVIA says.
Well, this is derived from the LVIA, isn't it? Yes, this is the LVIA entries.
Well, I think you just said Mr. Lee says the same. He doesn't.
Right. The LVIA on which Mr. Lee is adopted. Yeah. So that's where we see a difference in terms of sensitivity, and then in terms of magnitude, site high, surroundings medium to high, and then that's compared with medium and then declining for Mr.
Yes.
Lay, or the LVIA. Thank you. In terms of the value, we have already established that the site is not within a valued landscape, and indeed the site and its environs encompassed by your pink notation on your figure 3, you don't assert as being a valued landscape.
Not in NPPF terms, no.
No. Doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but it does affect the value you attribute to it, correct?
Well, I don't think the fact it's not a valued landscape in NPPF terms affects the value you attribute to it. It would be possible to have a high value landscape which isn't a valued landscape in NPPF terms.
Is that true? That's your position, is it? You can have a high valued landscape in LVIA terms, but isn't a valued landscape in 174A terms?
Yes, because paragraph 174A refers to its statutory status or identified quality in the development plan. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the test. So
you take that line. That's what I describe as the harsh line, which I have often tried to promote, that unless you're in the plan, you're out. But the more usual approach is to take box Glivia 5.1, or indeed now the new guidance from the Landscape Institute, which is what underpins the exercise in Mr. Liet's appendix.
Yes, no, as I set out in my evidence, I take the harsh approach to it. Well, not the harsh approach, it is what's written in paragraph 174A in the latest revision. It says valued landscapes in terms of their statutory status or identified quality. So if you don't have a statutory status and you don't have an identified quality, you're not a valued landscape in those terms. But that's why I say you could then still be a high value landscape because you might tick all the boxes in box 5.1.
But you haven't put that case forward, have you? And you didn't for a moment in evidence in chief or in any form of rebuttal take issue with the contents of Mr. Liet's appendix.
I say in my evidence that my approach to determining whether it's a valued landscape in NPPF terms is what I've just said, your harsh approach. Yeah. That's what I've said in my evidence. I've then gone on to judge what the value is, which is a separate exercise, and I've found it to be medium to high.
Well, you don't set out a box 5.1 exercise, do you?
I run through some of the points in it, yes.
And you don't set out the new
no, I review the way that's done as well.
And what we have already is an exercise which is figure 3, which is, again, wider than the site. Yes?
My figure 3.
Your figure 3.
Yes, that's a visual envelope.
The site and environs, as it's been described here, is wider than the site. And you would recognize, I hope, indeed you must have done by referencing medium to high, that value can change across that landscape depending on where you are and the factors playing upon it.
No, medium to high. It's not a range from medium to high. It's between medium and high, is my assessment for that area.
One factor somewhere between medium and high.
Yes.
That's how we're to read that exercise. It's not that it alters variably across the area, medium, some, high, others.
I mean, if you broke it down to the ultimate level, you might find some variation, but then it becomes impossible to make the overall judgment as to what the effects would be. So my evidence is that within the visual envelope on my figure 3, the value of that landscape is medium, between medium and high, not varying between the two.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And as you recognize in that answer you've just given me, of course, if you break it down, you will find areas which are lower than the medium-high. You might find areas which are higher than the medium-high.
Yes, but I think if you keep on breaking it down to smaller and smaller areas, it becomes impossible to make any kind of sensible judgment.
Thank you. Because the value of the site itself, if we look to the box above, you've only put down as medium.
No, that's a different thing. That's landscape features within and around the site.
Yes.
That is the value of the physical landscape features, not in terms of landscape character, but the hedges, the trees, things like that.
Yeah, but the features, of course, then add together to form landscape character, don't they?
Well, it's not just the features. Landscape character is also composed of views and things like that as well. It's not just the features. But the reason for having the separate line for landscape features within and around the boundary of the site is that's more to do with the physical change which the development would cause, what would be lost physically.
Do you have the LVA to hand, please?
I do.
LVA. Yeah. It's, so for your note, it's CD 527. Are you there, Mr. Etchells?
I have the document, yes.
Methodology section, which is Appendix A. Table A1, landscape value. You see
Yep.
that? The criterion for high is local designation with policy protection. That's not what we have here, is it?
No.
I'm grateful. Can we then just turn on a couple of pages to overall effects, which is page... I didn't see a page, actually. Can you find the heading? It's table A8 and table A9.
A9.
A8 and A9.
Yep.
You there?
Yes.
Overall effect, I'm reading the text now above table A8. Overall effect, level of effect, is derived from consideration magnitude of change and sensitivity of the receptor. And that's the process which both you and others have gone through. Yeah?
Yes.
Year one, you have a finding of, now help me with this, is it moderate to high, or is it somewhere between moderate and high?
Well, you're asking me to relate my assessment to the methodology of the LVIA. I haven't used this methodology.
No, but in terms of the agreement, you have no objection to the agreement, to the methodology that is here.
Well, no, but my assessment hasn't used this methodology.
Yeah,
So you can't ask me to explain my results against this methodology because I haven't used it.
That much I understand. I just want to have a help with your terminology. Is moderate dash high somewhere between moderate and high, or is it a range moderate going to high?
This is in terms of my value, or what?
No, your landscape effects.
Oh, the landscape effects on the site, well, on my, the area within visual envelope on my figure 3, it's moderate to high.
So, in other words, somewhere between...
Half a category between the two.
Exactly. So, somewhere above moderate but lower than high.
Yes.
So, it's not a range, but a midpoint.
Yes, and the reason for the midpoints is otherwise you've only got about 3 or 4 categories to use. So.
Understood entirely. Just wanted to clarify that, given what you told me earlier about the value point. Thank you. So, year one is above moderate but below high. Yes?
Well, it's halfway between the two, approximately.
Thank you very much. Year 15 is moderate.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We go back, please, to the table A8. You see that?
Yes.
And there's the matrix that, on this methodology, allows you to range magnitude against sensitivity. It's the bit below that which I want to pick up, please, the sentence below. Important effects are defined as those which are major, that's this word rather than high, major or moderate major, i.e. between moderate and major. Yeah?
That's what the LVIA says, yes?
Yes, that's the methodology with which you have no objection. And so you're finding in year one of moderate high, which is a point between moderate and high, would be an important effect on that basis.
Well, it would, but you have to be careful because my methodology uses more categories than are in this table.
Yeah.
So you can't transfer my terminology straight over to this table.
But so that's the first point. And the second point is, therefore, when you get to your year 15 and we're moderate, this would not be defined as an important effect.
Well, not according to the LVIA, no.
Thank you very much.
But my judgment would be that moderate effects are significant and should be taken into account.
Thank you. Taken into account, and no one's going to suggest that not be taken into account, let's look at table A9, moderate adverse. You see that? Proposed development will cause noticeable degradation landscape character elements existing views, if such an impact is found. These adverse effects may be of note, but are not likely to be key decision-making factors. Yeah?
Yes, but that's not my assessment. That's the methodology set out in the LVIA, which I haven't followed. It's not my definition of moderate adverse effects.
But it is a methodology with which you have no objection. If the inspector, having regard to all of the evidence, concludes that there is a moderate adverse effect, The methodology with which you have no objection indicates that's not a key determining factor.
Well, I've got no objection to that methodology having been used, but that is my assessment of moderate adverse effects is not made in respect to that definition of moderate adverse. It's made with respect to the definition set out in my appendices, which is my methodology.
Yeah, that much I understand.
And my definition of moderate adverse effects doesn't say that.
But do you accept, Mr. Etchells, that something which is moderate or below is not a key determining factor? It's going to be taken into account, but it's not going to be a key determining factor.
I think it depends on the circumstances. I think it may well be a determining factor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There isn't, is there, in your methodology, an equivalent to A9 in the methodology with which you have no objection?
Sorry, can you say that again?
There isn't, is there, within your methodology, an equivalent table to A9?
Yes, there is.
Is there?
It would be table 6.
That doesn't tell us about the importance of the results, does it?
No, but
Thank you.
there is... A lot of this comes back to the discussion in the GRVIA about the significant effects and the level of significance of which effects are significant for environmental impact assessment purposes. My own view is that you shouldn't really just draw a line and say effects below that level don't need to be considered. I think all effects should be considered. Because this is an EIA development, it's not necessary to draw that line and say which effects are significant in EIA terms and which aren't. But my view is that the moderate adverse long-term effects should be taken fully into account by the inspector in coming to a decision.
Mr. Etchells, I hope I haven't suggested that they're not going to be taken into account, or that we ask him to not take them into account. It's a question of how much weight the planner's then going to give them in due course. Yeah?
Well, I think that the weight is really for the planners, but I think the moderate adverse effects are significant, even though not significant in EIA terms, and have to be given full consideration.
Thank you. Let's turn to the second sheet then, please. Now, this is viewpoints, and here, of course, we're dealing with receptors from a visual perspective rather than landscape character. And
yes.
we've done a sort of compass exercise, north, east, south. There are 3 of your photos taken, and then west and northwest. Yeah.
Yes, I think we have to be careful because you say we're dealing with receptors, but these are viewpoints really, and the viewpoints can be related to receptors, but the viewpoints aren't receptors in themselves. We need to talk about the people.
I appreciate. Viewpoints are the users of the relevant footpath, the users of the relevant bit of road, represented for our purpose, for the inspector, by the photographs we've got.
Yes.
Yeah, forgive me, I was using a shorthand. Thank you. And if we just take up then your appendices, so we can relate that to the images we've got. Now again, I'm not going to take up time with anything which is less than moderate, so slight to moderate, or anything of that nature. I want to pick up the ones where you've got a high or moderate to high. If we start, please, with views, therefore, from the east, 14 and 15, and take up your photograph location plan, which is figure 2, the aerial photograph.
Yes.
We can see that 14 is the entrance into the paddock, looking across the paddock into the proposed
it is,
site.
yes.
And 15 is the entrance to the site itself.
It's the field gate, yes.
Yeah, okay. And again, it's not going to be any great surprise, is it, for the inspector to find that if you stand at the entrance or adjacent to the entrance, you will see a significant change in the nature of the view before you when one turns a greenfield site into a housing estate.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. If we take up the take up the table, which is table 2, within the same set of appendices, but don't lose that map.
Yes.
You have that. And you turn to the last page of table 2. Are we to read photos 14 and 15 as partly, I say, partly informing this receptor, which is used as a local roads half yard?
Partly, I think, yes,
Yes.
but also other photographs, such as photograph 2, which is
well,
from
we'll come to that in a
further
second.
to the south.
That's very helpful. And so when we look to the effects in winter year 1, moderate to high motorised, high for pedestrian and cyclists, and then all effects would tend to decrease in some extent over time, locally dominant presence, new houses and views just from the south of the site, we'd say also immediately from the east of the site.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm grateful. Thank you. Then we have views from the south. Go back to your photograph, please, figure 2. View 2 is just north of the bridge, isn't it?
It is, yes.
The inspector will see that. And you've got a photograph from view 2. Have you been to the site recently?
I haven't, no.
No. I think it was April, wasn't it, when you visited for your photographs purposes?
It was 2 occasions, but close together in April, yeah.
Yeah. The inspector, obviously, as you heard, went yesterday, as did I, and there'll be a further site visit. You appreciate the growth of the hedge has rather, or maybe you don't because you haven't seen it, has rather altered the view from photograph point 2 now, because the growth of the hedge means you don't actually see the development of Wrington.
I can imagine that might be the case, although in my photograph 2, I don't know when the hedge was cut, but there is some growth on that. So obviously with a regularly maintained agricultural hedge, the height will fluctuate by up to a metre or so maybe.
The inspector will see it again, but let's just look at the photograph you've got. What, of course, we see in the photograph 2, in the photograph, and it may be depending on how the hedge is managed at any given moment, you do or you don't, what you see is the existing housing lying across, as you put it, the ridge to the west of half-yard Butts Batch. You see the white of the houses. The church tower at that point is actually hidden behind those trees, isn't it?
Yes, I've put an arrow on, but I had to put the arrow on because you may not see it otherwise.
Yeah.
Because this was taken in April, you can see the tower through the trees, but I would imagine now it would be better screened.
Yeah, absolutely right. But we see it in the context of existing housing, and we know from the historic maps that, and indeed just looking at it, that's post-war housing to the south of the historic core of the village, isn't it?
As I understand, the houses in that view are, yes.
Yeah.
But I would agree with you that you do see it in context of the houses. You can clearly see the houses there, but you can't really see the vast majority of the village. What you can see to the west of the road is about 5 houses, partly screened by boundary vegetation. So you're not really seeing the major part of the settlement.
No, but I think the receptor, that is the user of the road, is under no illusions that he or she is approaching the village, is he? Not least because there's a sign that says so.
Well, the sign would rather give it away,
It does
but in
rather,
terms of the existing content of the view, you're not looking at the major part of the settlement, but with the development in place, you would be looking at a lot of new houses.
Oh.
So there would be a significant change, which is the reason for the quite high-level adverse effects.
It's still a village, isn't it? With the
Sorry?
proposal in place, it's still a village. Not suggesting otherwise, are you?
Well, it would still be a village, but in that view, which is what we're assessing here in this assessment of visual effects, there would be a significant degree of change in the view, because the number of houses that you can see would go up from something like 6 to the west of the road to most of the new 61.
But we know, don't we, Mr. Etchells, that change doesn't equal harm. It's still a village. You're approaching a village now. You're approaching a village in the future.
Change doesn't necessarily have to equal harm by definition, no. It's what the degree and nature of the change in the view is.
Yes.
And in that particular view, there would be a high level of adverse change. And
Why, forgive me, Mr.
I think that view is also shared by the LVIA, which says that the effects at that point will be moderate to major adverse.
What we have at the moment is approach to a village. Yeah?
Yes?
And what we'll have in the future is an approach to a village. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So when we're keeping Wrington, for example, it's still a village, isn't it?
It would still be a village, but what you would see in the view would change significantly, and there would be significant adverse effects. The fact that you're approaching a village doesn't really have an enormous bearing on the significance of the visual effects.
Thank you. Now, view 1, let me go to that one next, is on the same plan. It's figure 2. It's the gap that one finds in the vegetation along the river, not long after leaving the bridge if one's going west on the permissive footpath.
Yes, there is more than one gap. That is one of the gaps.
Yes. I mean, the gaps, as one journeys along, and the inspector has done it, so I'll again be brief. As one journeys along, first of all, I know landscape architects love the phrase kinetic experience. It's a series of kinetic views as you go along there, yes?
Well, yes and no. It's a kinetic experience.
It's a
You
kinetic
can use
experience.
the terminology because you're walking along a path.
Thank you.
But I think in this particular case, it's more a series of static views rather than a kinetic view, because you've got some gaps in the vegetation and you would or may tend to pause at those gaps and look at the view.
Okay, well that's a perfectly fair way of putting it. It's a kinetic experience upon which are actually windows through the gaps in vegetation, if I can put it that way.
Yes,
where you get a view through.
Which I think may cause you to pause and look at the view and say, oh, there's a church over there.
But it equally means that there are stretches where there are no such views. So they are intermittent windows, by definition.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think they're intermittent. I think it's fair to say that there's more obstruction than there is gap.
That's very fair. And you happen to have photographed one of those intermittent windows as your photograph 1.
Yep.
Which others have done as well. You, of course, haven't zoomed your shot. I know others have zoomed shots through here, but that would be contrary to the approach your institute advocates, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think in some circumstances you can use a zoom lens view, but you should also include a normal view to go with it so you can see what the actual view you would obtain on the site
You
is.
only do it for identification purposes, not for appreciation purposes. Thank you very much. And again, what we've got is just recognising these are aides memoir to the inspector on his site visit. What we've got in photograph 1 is a village, haven't we?
Well, it's a view of a very small number of houses on the edge of a village with the main part of the village not present in the view.
No, but you don't mistake it as not being a village, do you?
No, I think the fact that the church is there indicates that there's a village there,
Yeah, so
albeit
that's-
you can't see the majority of the village in that view. So the presence of a lot of new houses in the view would lead to a large change.
No, the presence of new houses in the view would reinforce the fact it's a village. It's a village now.
Well, you're aware that you're near to a village, and there's and that there's a village most of which can't be seen in the view at the moment. If you put 61 new houses in that view, it would still be a village, and you'd still be aware there's a village there, but the village would have got a lot closer to you and would have occupied what is at the moment an attractive field and would take up the foreground of the views to the church and the hills.
The foreground of the view, that is up to the intervening hedge, remains open and undeveloped, yes, behind which we have a village. The view currently is of a village, isn't it?
No, I don't agree with that.
You don't think that's a view of a village?
You're aware that there's a village there because there's a church there apart from anything else, but it's not a view of the village. You can't see the village. You can see a few houses on the edge of the
You
village.
can't see the whole village, but
No.
you know you're looking at a village. You're looking that happens to Wrington. It could be any other village, but it's a village. And in the future, if you let me I'll ask the question. The future, it's right, isn't it? You would also know it's a village.
Yes, you know there's a village there at the moment. If you put 61 houses in the middle ground of the view, you would obviously know there's a village there. But
Yes.
the change in the view, the visual effects, which is what we're talking about at the moment, would be significant and adverse because there'd be 61 houses slap bang in the middle of the view, a lot closer to the viewpoint.
Why is that in any way harmful to a view? What you've got is a village with a countryside setting, the woods and hills behind, which you've identified, the church, and houses. In the future, you would have a village with a countryside setting, the woods and hills behind, a church, and houses. Houses, importantly, that your authority takes no exception to in their design terms. Now, that's not harm, is it, Mr. Etchells?
No, I think
it's
it is
change,
harm.
but it's not harm.
Well, I think it is harm, and the LVIA produced as part of the application recognises it as harm. There would, in my view, be clear harm. A lot of the landscape setting which you referred to would be taken up by new built development and the activity associated with the houses. It would cease to be landscape.
Let's look at photo 19 also from south. This time I need to go to a different map. It's the next one on. And it's the other side of the road. So you're going east on the footpath, but again still close to the river and looking north. So photo 19, can we go to that?
Yep.
And the church there. First of all, can I just check the location of photo 19? Forgive me, I said next to the river. It's not. It's on the footpath as you've climbed up the hill, haven't you?
Well, it's not climbing up the hill. It's on fairly level ground just to the east. Well, it's where the number 19 is on the map.
Number 19, that's right. I was getting it wrong. It's not next to the river on the eastern side.
That's number 17, I think.
It's a further field away, yeah? And if we just look at where 19 is in relation to the appeal site and where the church sits on the OS map. You got that?
Yep.
19, the development will sit to the left of this photo, if I can put it that way, lower and to the left of the church where those trees are.
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much. And indeed, you've recorded only moderate, then just declining to slight adverse.
Yes.
Thanks, very helpful. Thank you. From the west and from the northwest, there are two we need to pick up. View 26 is on the old railway line, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's equivalent to a shot in the appellant's evidence, view 6. But let's go to your photo 26 for the sake of speed. If I were to turn my head in this photo, I would see the village off shot, wouldn't I?
You would, yes, to the left of the railway line, which you can see on the edge, you'd see the rest of the village and the church.
That's right. And of course, the inspector, being a real person in a real situation, will do that, won't he?
Yes.
He will move his head around. And so the development lies to the right-hand side of where those white houses on the ridge are shown.
Well, I think it would be in front of them and to the right, and
right.
Extending to the right.
Thank
Yes.
you very much. And again, in terms of the experience of the receptor, he or she walking this route has gone either through or past the village, and the village remains on their left-hand side if they're going in that particular direction.
Yes, or if you're going the other way, you'd be approaching the village, and you'd be able to see it ahead of you and to the right.
Thank you. And again, the experience is of a village in countryside.
The experience at the moment is of a village in the countryside. With the development in place, you would see that the extent of that village extending to the right across the view, up and over the ridge line and down towards the river.
It's a larger village, but it's still a village in the countryside.
Yes, don't say anywhere in my evidence that the nature of the settlement would change.
Good.
What we're talking about here is visual effects on views.
Thank you very much. It's a village in the countryside with at least the prospect, through reserved matters, development of a softer urban edge than I'm afraid I've described it as I think it was unappealing, undistinguished, shall we say, 20th century development that we can currently see.
I think it depends on the view you're looking at. The views from the south, which is where we started, I think that is already a soft edge to the
I'm
settlement.
on view 26, if you wouldn't mind.
If we're going to talk about it, I don't think we can just talk about one specific view, but view 26, yes, those two-storey houses on the edge of the village there, I think they're at the end of King's Road. They are unscreened at the moment.
Thank you very much. View 28, we need to go back to your photo plan, but figure 3. 28 is on the footpath coming down from West Hay Road.
Yep.
You got that? And if we take the shot 28, so 2 pages on. Again, if we were on site, we would turn our heads to the left and we would see the rest of the village and the church tower, wouldn't we?
Yes, it's off to the left. Yeah,
And indeed the pylon, which crosses at this point.
yeah, you can see the wires in the sky of this photograph.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, what we're going to have with the development in place, and we're going to put some ranging poles out to show where the edge of the settlement development will be, is an extension of the village to the right-hand side of its existing extent.
Yes, it's an extension, yes.
In the context of the village existing and continuing to be so.
Yes, no, I agree with that. That's obviously the case, but it would be an extension across what is at the moment countryside, across the ridge line. Yeah, the development would extend into the countryside.
Thank you very much. As inevitably must be the case if one's going to have CS32 development outside settlement boundaries.
Well, yes. If there is additional development on the edge of a settlement, it would, by definition, if it's on a greenfield site, extend into the countryside.
Thank you very much.
It's the way in which it extends into the countryside and the nature of the countryside it extends into. You could envisage a development on the edge of a settlement which was just into one enclosed field with tall hedges and trees around it, and in that case the effects would be far less than they are here, where you've got the development extending into an open field with no containment at all to its west.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Etchells. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let me just, I don't think there are any questions from me, but let me just double check. Bear with me a moment, please. No, there aren't. Anything by way of re-examination from you, Mr. Wadsley?
2 or 3 questions, or 3 or 4 questions, perhaps, if I may, sir.
Please.
Let me make a note. Doing this in reverse order, Mr. Etchell, so starting with the last few questions, if I may. You were asked a number of questions relating to the photographs, and I'll take photograph viewpoint 1 as an example of what I like to deal with. No, I beg your pardon, not photograph 1, my fault, photograph 2, I think. Or photograph 19, actually, just to make life really easy for you, and photograph 26, so you know where I'm coming from. You were asked a number of questions about those photographs, and it was pointed out to you that they are viewpoints of a village. There are houses. You can recognize the houses as being part of a village, with or without the church tower in some cases. And the suggestion is being put to you is, well, imagine you've now got a number of other houses, 61 in this particular case, on the edge of the village. You look across from these viewpoints, you will see houses, of course, but you see houses at the moment. And you will still know that you're near or approaching or looking at a village. And the point that you make is that there's harm. Now, what I'd like you to help me with is, given the way those questions are put and given what you say about the situation, why exactly do you say that there is harm in that situation?
Well, because it's the nature of the change in the view. I mean, to say that you're already looking at a village and you would also look at a village after the development is very much a circular argument, as I said in my evidence in chief. That would mean that you can always put development next to a settlement and it could never cause any harm because you'd still be looking at a settlement. But what you need to look at is the nature of the land which would be taken up by the development and the magnitude of change to the view. That's what the assessment is about. And in, say, photograph 2, the views from the south, you are looking at the edge of a village, but in the particular view, you're looking at green fields on the edge of the village, with views also to the church and the hills beyond. And with the development in place, you wouldn't be looking at green fields on the edge of the village. You'll be looking at 61 new houses taking up those green fields, and that is visual harm.
So the, the nature of the harm, where you're putting it, is that you've got views over green fields, you've got views to the church, you've got views to the hills beyond. Is that how I understood you correctly?
Yes, and the harm would be in terms of the development taking up those green fields and obstructing or changing the character of the views to the church and the hills. The view, the nature of the view with the development in place would be markedly different to the view at the moment, and that change would be adverse.
Thank you. A slightly different question, but it arises from viewpoint 1, because, as was pointed out, it's from a gap in the vegetation, the trees, that is, when you're walking along the footpath. And there's a debate about these are kinetic views or series of static views, however one puts it. If you're a walker and going along a footpath like that, where you have trees or hedges that obstruct the view, what is the effect of having gaps when you're a walker and you come to a gap?
Yes, well, I did try to say that, I think, in my answer, that it's not a purely kinetic view as if you were walking along an open footpath or open countryside where the view would be constantly changing. If you're walking along a route such as this, generally speaking, you would be doing it for the pleasure of the exercise and walking through the countryside. So you would tend, not everybody would necessarily, but you would tend to be likely to stop at where there is a view, if there isn't a view for most of the time. It's similar if you're walking along a footpath with a tall hedge and you come to a gate. You might lean on the gate and look at the view, particularly if the view is attractive. Yeah. And I think the same applies to views such as the one in photograph 1, that where you come to a gap, you're aware that the village and the church is over there, you're aware that there are attractive views. When you come to the gap, in my view, you might tend to stop and look at it and appreciate the view. Indeed. So the views are intermittent, as was put to me, but I don't think that means you don't take any notice of them. You wouldn't necessarily just walk straight past them.
So help me with this then a little bit. If the views are intermittent and you're stopping because you've now got a view, hedge or trees previously, you've now got a view, you stop to look, what then to the walker is the value of that view?
Well, I think the value is a bit higher because it's where you get a view, so you tend to appreciate it more, and that may be why, or partly why, you're taking the walk.
Thank you. You asked some questions about the way in which the LVIA and you had judged moderate adverse. And you were taken, I think, oh dear me, yes, you were taken to your table 6. So if you would go to your table 6, assuming I can find it. Yes. So you've got in your table, table 6, get to the correct page, where you start with no effect, insignificant, slight adverse, and so on and so forth, and you get through to beneficial if you turn over the page. The LVIA has approached it in a particular way. If the inspector wants to know whether you consider something is moderate adverse or slight adverse or whatever it may be, what does he have to do in looking at your evidence? What ought he to look at? What ought he to take into account?
Well, firstly, he should look at the section of the evidence where I say that the effects are of that level, because there is an explanatory piece of text there, but also in terms of the table which sets out some of the criteria which would help to form the judgment of, say, moderate adverse effects. They are the bullet points listed in the row for moderate adverse. But what he shouldn't do is look at what it says in the LVIA, because those are the criteria that were used in the LVIA to make their judgments. I didn't make my judgments according to what it says in the LVIA.
Does he get any help at all in looking at the LVIA if he wants to work out how you've approached moderate adverse or indeed any other judgment?
No, it's nothing to do with it.
Right. Yes. You were asked at the beginning of your cross-examination about the Wardell-Armstrong approach, and you accepted that, as it says in section 4, that this is something that has been approached at a strategic level, and you are taking to, I think I'm right in saying 4.1.15. The assessment of land was undertaken at a strategic level. And then you were taken to 5.215, where the classification is expressed as being determined in broad terms, and so on. If you're judging or seeking to judge the way in which Wardell-Armstrong approached their assessment of the landscape, does it help if you pause or you stop at and go no further than those expressions of broad terms or strategic level or whatever it may be in those paragraphs?
No, I don't think it does, because it's clearly undertaken for a strategic purpose, and I suppose at a strategic level in those terms, but it does also go, as I did say in my answer, I think it does go to a much greater level of detail than that. It's not saying that the landscape over broad swathes of countryside is of a certain level of sensitivity. It actually breaks it down, and you know, for the sake of argument, it doesn't say that all of the landscape around Wrington is of a high level of sensitivity. It actually breaks down the landscape around Wrington into, if we go around the settlement, just about 12 different categories as you go around the perimeter of the settlement. I just counted that roughly, but it does go into, and obviously it can't go down to the individual site level because it didn't know where the sites were, and it can't go down to the individual field level because that would just become too detailed, but it does contain a reasonable level of detail.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Etchells. I think, looking at the clock, it's probably time to have a break, and that will allow us to give the witnesses a chance to switch over. So if you could ensure that everybody's set up. Clock on the wall says about 5 to. Everybody comfortable with a sort of 20-minute break if we resume at 15:15? Yeah, not. Good, we'll do that. So we'll adjourn now and resume at 3:15 when we'll hear from Mr. Dorr. Thank you. That strikes me as being I can't quite see you, but it's not. I think with a bit of neck craning, that should be fine. It's important that you're able to see your witness, Mr. Storer. Are you content? Are you happy with your setup, or do you need a little longer?
No, it's fine, sir. Thank you.
So, okay, we'll press on then, and if you could introduce your witness, please. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This is Adrian Dorser. He's a local resident. He's here to give his experience of living in the village. Mr. Dorr, can you just explain how long you've lived in the village, please?
19 and a half years.
And you live along Butts Batch,
That's correct.
and your property actually faces onto the field that's known as Butts Batch.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And you've, in fact, just to clarify, you've been asked by the group Keep Wrington as Wrington to come and speak on about the landscape, but you've actually already submitted a full objection of your own before this.
Landscape and how it relates to heritage, yes.
Okay, thank you. So the first part of Mr. Dorr's evidence sets out the introduction, and he explains what he sees and understands by an Old English village. Are you happy to read that, or would you like him to just run through the points, the 4 points that he's put down?
Well, it's entirely up to you. I'm always mindful of interested parties who may not have read and heard, or who may not be fully familiar with the evidence. So, I would like to, for Mr. Dorr's position to be sort of communicated for the benefit of interested parties who are watching, and how best that's done, I will leave up to you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Mr. Dorr, if you can just then outline the introduction of your statement that sets out your understanding of what an Old English village and the character that comes with that, please.
Yes, basically I'm saying there's a perception that Wrington is an Old English country village, and that this perception is based on 3 distinct parts, namely Old English being established through the buildings and churches, not just the church. Country through the land that is in question at the moment, and also village, small village, which the expansion of the boundaries will destroy that concept or perception of small village. That in essence is what we are arguing. And
the part of this perception of it being a small village as you approach it from the south, and it's generally referred to as the gateway to the village from the south, sets the village setting in the green countryside, the actual, and where this proposed site is.
Well, I mean, as soon as you enter the village from Half Yard, your left-hand view will immediately be occupied by this huge urban sprawl. It will obviously destroy the bucolic setting of Wrington, its scenic views of it. It will expand the boundaries of the village substantially, thereby destroying the perception of a small village, and it will obviously destroy the countryside upon which these buildings will be developed, thereby destroying 2 of the 3 elements which contribute to our heritage. And also it will substantially interfere with views of the church and of the village, thereby destroying all 3 elements of our heritage.
All right, thank you. And the so by bucolic you mean scenic or picturesque?
Bucolic, by bucolic I mean clearly farming land and as well as scenic, because we've got to separate bucolic obviously as farming land, and that farming land is the contributor to countryside, because the perception of Wrington is an old English village, a countryside village or country village, old English country village. So that land contributes significantly to that perception. That's the bucolic side. The scenic one is that it is set in the valley with the backdrop of the hills and all of that. That's the scenic component.
Thank you.
All of which this development will destroy.
And so moving on to the landscape and views, it has obviously been covered in great detail by Mr. Etchells.
Mr. Etchells did an excellent job.
Okay, thank you. So the only thing I'm going to ask is if you could have a look at photograph 8 on your evidence. And if you can just describe to the inspector what you're actually looking at from that perspective.
That's a view from the north, from Mark Bush paddock, and it shows the church spire, and immediately to the left of that you will see the field in question. So if you view this from the scenic paddock, which is a picnic area, which is a popular picnic area, that field that you see there will be built upon, and you will have these rather an ugly urban sprawl there.
Thank you.
I mean, the other pictures that I've submitted support exactly what Mr. Etchells said. You cannot go and put 62 houses on the southwestern boundaries of this village and not expect it to have impacted negatively on the perception of Wrington. And that perception, as I said, is of an old English country village.
Thank you. And you've mentioned the obviously the views of the Grade 1 listed church town nestled in the village with the rolling countryside of Wrington Vale in the foreground that gives a sense to the village's history. So, point 19. Just in point 20, if you'd just like to read that out and elaborate a little bit about the Bronze Age, which you have quite a lot of knowledge about, please.
As a village, Wrington has prehistoric Bronze Age roots, with the discovery of Bronze Age axes in the village and also the home of a Roman villa. Historical records date back over 1,000 years. The first written records identify a settlement in 904 AD, when King Edward, the son of Alfred the Great, reconfirmed the grant of Wrington to Duke Ethelfrid, and there is a reference to that.
And that's the public reference, thank you.
Yeah.
And then in paragraph 21, it's the Wikipedia entry to All Saints Church, and basically what it highlights in that, if you want to read, in fact, well, the second, if you read it all out, but it's the second sentence about the tower.
The Wikipedia entry for the Church of All Saints identifies that it has 13th century foundations, but that the current building dates from between 1420 and 1450. The tall four-stage tower has been described as one of the highest achievements of architectural genius, and the reference to that.
Okay, thank you. And just in your, you then go on to describe that on paragraph 23, how the higher ground of the proposed site. If you'd just like to read that out as well, please.
Due to the higher ground of the proposed site, which dominates the west side of the village, the applicant's proposed development would dominate your entire left-hand view. the perception created would be one of a large modern village. And I think that's very important with what Mr. Etchells was mentioning. As soon as you, it would destroy the perception of a small village when you go and place a huge development on the entrance to a village such as Wrington. It'll completely destroy that perception of small village.
And thank you. And also the paragraph 24, just to make that point, please.
Similarly, on entering the village from the west along West Hay Road, the proposed development would dominate the landscape set on top of the highest point of Wrington Vale.
Right, thank you. And in paragraph 25, you do go on to describe what is in fact a large conservation area, which I don't think we'll need to cover. I think that's well known. And in your summary in paragraph 26, please.
The building of 61 new dwellings would destroy the current commonly held perception of Wrington, vastly diminishing its sense of history, destroying the perception of a countryside and on that of a setting of a small village.
And that relates back to your
Well,
earlier point of the bucolic setting in the rolling landscape that
in the scenic setting.
we've already heard about. Thank you. And then you go on to describe opportunity costs is the heading. If you could just explain what you mean by that, please.
Well, an opportunity cost is a cost if you've lost an opportunity. So by destroying Wrington and its heritage, we would have lost an opportunity of preserving our heritage for those in the future. And let's face it, that it has substantial intrinsic value as a site, which increases in value rather rapidly in modern times, but it also has a huge economic value, and that huge economic value is in terms of tourism and foreign exchange earning. And we've got to realize that with our ancestral linkage right back to prehistoric times, this places Wrington into a rather unique category of small villages. It isn't like any other little small village. This has prehistoric roots, a Roman occupation. So it is something rather special, particularly in North Somerset. There will not be another village that has ancestral linkage to like we have. So we've got to take all this into account. So it's a huge potential tourist earner as well.
Right. And I made the point earlier, but you do live obviously in Butts Batch, but that has given you the opportunity, and you regularly, I believe, see people walking past your house to enjoy the local views.
Well, the countryside around the village is precious to most Wringtonians, and most of the Wringtonians go out into the fields and walk, not those fields because there's no right of way, but on the fields surrounding it, they walk. With COVID, there has been a huge uptake in people walking, and people just generally love the setting. That is exactly why they live there, because it's countryside. And here we are sitting here discussing the destruction of a key element of Wrington. And as I said to you earlier, with the perception of Wrington, you cannot go and take views of the church and say that is an exclusive contributor to our heritage, when it is not. The countryside is an equal contributor to that heritage as the church. We aren't discussing the destruction of the church here, but we're discussing the destruction of the countryside, which I find absurd. So, I don't know.
And as you're making, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way you're discussing that, you consider this countryside to be special.
Absolutely, it's part of our heritage. You can't separate it. They're intrinsically joined.
And just to conclude, I don't wish to labour the point, but by building this proposed development on that site, what effect would that have?
Well, obviously, you're going to destroy the countryside by building on this. You're also going to destroy the perception of a small village because you've just expanded the boundaries of the village substantially. And believe you me, you can't hide this expansion through trees and other stuff because trees and other screening devices are not going to replace lost countryside and expansion of boundaries. That is lost forever. And there's just no way you bring that back.
Yes. I don't think I've got any further questions, or I don't think need to go further, sir.
Thank you. We'll go straight on to cross-examination, then, please, Mr. Boyle.
Mr. Dorr, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Dorr, can I just check? I don't understand you to have any landscape or heritage qualifications or expertise, is that correct?
No.
No, that's helpful. You'll appreciate...
Not that I think it's relevant here.
You'll appreciate I won't, therefore, be asking you detailed questions in the way that I would of an expert witness. The inspector obviously will have expert evidence on heritage and landscape from both the appellants and the authority. Can I just ask some clarificatory points on your document? So I've got your proof with the photographs.
Yes.
And they run through from 1 to 8.
Correct.
Yeah. Firstly, would you mind, very kindly, outside the inquiry, marking on a plan for us where they were taken from? Because that will allow us all to compare them to the other photographs that we have in the evidence, if you wouldn't mind. That's very helpful. And then when you do them, perhaps you could do it for us now, actually. Can you tell us which of these have been zoomed in? I mean, I'll give you an example. Photo 1 looks as if it's, as it were, being cropped, in that we know the view is wider than that because to the left is the village. But has it also been zoomed in the sense of being made larger by the camera?
I can't answer that one because I'm not particularly clued up on whether or not I zoomed it and how much I zoomed it or what it was. All I was trying to do was capture the essence, the scale of it all in this picture 1. I was simply trying to get it all in.
You took these photos, did you?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's skip over 1 and 2. 3 is plainly zoomed, isn't it? You've focused in on the tower.
Yes.
Yeah. I did about 4 and 5 and 6, but 7 again is zoomed. Is this from the other side of the river? Where is this one taken from? 7.
This is taken on the southwest corner, or right on the corner, looking back over. So this would be the boundary mark, the boundary hedge of the development. So that where you have the red writing is actually where the buildings will be going. That is the development site.
Forgive me, in terms of where you were standing for the photograph, were you on a public right-of-way?
No.
No, okay. Thank you. And photo 8, is that also zoomed?
Apologies, this is not my photograph, but I think it was given to me to demonstrate. But I think with all these photographs, I'm simply trying to get a perception of the overall area.
Yeah, okay, all right, that's very helpful. The only other matter I want to take up with you, if you don't mind, is, do you remember you said frequently about destroying the sense of the historic village?
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if you have access, or if someone can provide you with the appendices to Mr. Lie. Have you seen those at all?
I can't recall,
No,
but
okay.
I probably have.
I think Is someone helpful from the... No, here we are. Mr... It's, if whoever's helping Mr. Dorr, it's volume 2 I'm after. Volume 2 of the, which is the drawings and photos. No, I want the whole thing. Well, here, it's coming to you. Here we are. There you are. You're getting a bigger version than we are, Mr. Dorr. Okay. Now, first thing, the inspector has this too. You'll see the front covers an illustrative sketch of the proposal.
Yes.
Worked up with the planting and so on. And I hope you can see the church, you can see the paddock,
Yes.
and you can see Butt's Batch. Yeah, that's just for orientation. But can I take you on to, if you look to the page with the letter E, top right, it's entitled The Proposals. So blue letter E, top right. I think it's internal pagination 7. Yeah, you got that?
Yes.
And you can see, I hope, that the proposed development area isn't the entirety of the red line area. You appreciate that?
Yes.
There's a distinction, and that distinction, in fact, we know from other evidence, runs along a historic landscape feature, so that the development is, I've described it elsewhere as an L shape. It wraps round the development of Butt's
Yes.
Batch and the paddock. Yeah? And the land south of that reinstated landscape feature is for ecological and drainage mitigation, etc. That's undeveloped. Yeah? And you can see there, I hope, the extent of the built development and the way in which the western edge aligns with the western edge of the development, or existing development, north of the track.
Yes.
Yeah, you got that. I'm grateful. And the southern part of the site, where it abuts Butt's Batch itself, or a half yard if it is at that stage, again aligns with the existing development on the other side of that road. So the southernmost extent of Wrington as we currently have it. You see
Yes.
that? I'm grateful. Now, with that in mind, can you just go a couple of pages forward, and you should find a plan at, again, blue letter J, which is page 13. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so what we've just done allows us to notionally put in the development area within the red line, because you can actually see the wiggly green. Yeah?
Yes.
So you can mentally sketch in where the development area would be. And this drawing, you may know from other evidence, produced by the design review panel. And it's got a notation, historic context, post-war context, and modern context. You see that in 3 different colours.
Yes.
Yeah? And I don't want to know your exact address, Mr. Dorr, but you say you live on Butt's Batch.
Correct.
Are you in the yellow or the blue?
I'm in the yellow.
In the yellow. So that's post-war context. So that in itself is post-war village growth.
Yes.
Yeah? And what you and the inspector, of course, can see from this plan is, perhaps unsurprisingly, we have the core of the village, which is the historic core, and we know where the church is within this. The inspector will have seen that. And progressively, as time has gone on, there has been incremental growth to the village, both post-war, so post-45, shown here as yellow, and also blue, the purple, the modern context. Indeed, Cox's green is marked in letters and words.
Yes.
You see that? Yeah. And the proposal, I'd suggest to you, coming in, it would also be marked purple, wouldn't it, for our purposes, like Cox's green. Yeah.
Yes.
And so what we can see from this is the way in which, like perhaps every other village in the country, incremental growth over the 20th and then 21st century, but not such that it ceases to be a village.
Most certainly it will cease to be a small village, the perception of a small village, because although this red line expands the boundaries, the visual boundaries, because when you come into Wrington, you do not see, as Mr. Etchells was trying to explain earlier, you only see the sign, and then you go up the road, and then you see the village. Whereas with this development, what's going to strike you immediately is this huge urban sprawl. Now, we should learn by our mistakes. Cox's Green was a mistake. Now we are trying to replicate this mistake in Butts Patch. Because if you go and place a big urban development on the entrance to any village, you're going to change the perception of that village. No longer are you going to see it as a small village, you're going to see it as just more urban development, just another urban development.
But
And in that, we have lost the perception of Wrington, which is an old English country village.
But Mr. Daw, do you not see that your own yellow area was an extension to the historic village?
Fortunately, yes, sir, I do. I do acknowledge that, but I also acknowledge the intelligence of the previous planners that attempted to hide all this development effectively, so that when you do come into this village, you're not hit, boom, in the face with ugly urban development. As in Cox's Green. Cox's Greens is an absolute aberration, and we should learn by this aberration, not replicate it. So, because you have now quite adequately shown to us the massive expansion to the boundaries. So in these massive expansions to the boundaries, you've lost the perception of a small village, which is, and when I say this perception of a village, that is what is commonly held by Wringtonians.
I see. And then we go to the front cover again once more, if you wouldn't mind. That image that we see there, that's what you're suggesting is a massive and ugly urban sprawl.
Without question, sir.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, Mr. Daw. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I don't have any questions for you, Mr. Daw.
Thank you, sir.
Was there anything by way of re-examination, Mr. Storer?
Just briefly, do you know the date your house was built, Mr. Daw? Do you know if it's
To be honest, sir, no.
Sorry?
No, I do not
Okay.
know.
All right. No, I will leave that then. And I think the point that you were making is that the number of houses that make up the yellow houses that have been pointed out to you, how many of those are there along the road?
Sorry, how many are?
How many of the houses are in Butts Patch? Just on, you know, those yellow houses that you live in that have been pointed out.
I mean, I don't know. I haven't gone and counted them, but
if I said about 20, would that be something? Would that be an accurate figure? A lot of those more modern houses.
That's an excessive number.
Okay, so it's under 20.
Well under.
Okay, so there are.
And as also they follow the road line, so they haven't gone out. They've gone up like that, so it's a narrow sliver. So when you come into the village, your perception is still of a small village. It's not a big, huge expanse that's gone out broadly like that.
So it doesn't. I think your point is that it follows. There is a small number of houses. A lot. Shall we? Let's say a lot less than 61
Substantially.
houses that have just been built along the existing roadway. They do not. The developers at that time did not build across the fields and set up what effectively looks like a extension that has secondary roads. It has a main road and then it has secondary roads coming off it.
Yes. I mean, I just think that the previous planners to the village had the foresight to understand this and see that if you're coming into the village, to limit that impact on what you're seeing, because when they put the houses in, they realized that they were building in an old area and had to limit it. But as long as you can hide a development effectively in trees. But this development is just too expansive to hide behind trees. If you had one house, two houses on the road, you could hide it. But you cannot hide this development behind trees, because you've lost, in essence, countryside, and you've lost the perception of a small village. Two of the key elements to the perception of Wrington, commonly held perception of Wrington, of an old English country village. And that is our heritage, and that's what we wish to preserve. That's heritage.
Thank you, sir. I've got no further questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The only question in my mind now is, I think, well, we need a moment or two for the witnesses to swap over, so I think we'll have a short adjournment. But I'm anticipating, well, what was your estimate? I think it was 3/4 of an hour in Chief, was it, Mr. Boyle? Are you comfortable with dealing with Chief and then probably stopping for today, then hearing from interested parties tomorrow morning, and then resuming with your witnesses? It's a long break between being in Chief and then moving on to cross-examination, but I think if we keep the two separate, that makes it a bit more comfortable for you as a witness. Are you comfortable with that? Yeah, okay. Well, we'll do that. Perhaps we'll give ourselves a 10-minute break until 5:02 now, just to allow everybody to swap over. So we'll adjourn now, resume at 5 minutes to 4, and then hear the evidence in Chief. Thank you. is now 5-2. Everybody appears to be where they need to be, so we'll resume. Your first witness, please, Mr. Boyle.
So thank you. Mr. Lee is just settling in. So you should have from him a proof and a series of appendices. Section 7, is that right, Ms. Lee, is your summary and conclusions? So there isn't a separately published summary, but it's in section 7. There is. Right, I don't have a separate summary, but it's there. So, you probably have all the documents to hand that we'll need, unless you put them away after.
I'm hoping so.
Yeah. So we'll just get cracking if we may. Mr. Lee, are you settled? Mr. Lee?
I am,
Yep.
yes, thank you.
We go to your main proof. You're Martin John Lee, is that correct?
It is.
And you say you're instructed by the appellants to prepare landscape proof and to prepare the public inquiry. In reviewing the proposal's residential development off Butts Batch, you take into consideration all the relevant pre-application consultation and application documents. You've liaised with other members of the appeal team, as well as undertaken 2 detailed site appraisals, stroke local area visits, ahead of preparing your expert evidence. You tell us a little bit about your expertise, and we have your full CV set out at Appendix 1 of your appendices.
Correct.
Thank you very much. I won't take up any further time in respect of that. You set out the reasons for refusal, and it's reason 2 which you directly speak to. That's at your paragraph 1.6. And it might just be worth identifying the elements of that. The proposed development by reason of its location within an area of landscape of high sensitivity of change, that's the first allegation.
Yes.
In a prominent location at the entrance to Wrington along Half Yard, and a scale in excess of that supported by core strategy CS32 as part of the hierarchical approach of settlements, would substantially alter an area of attractive open countryside, urbanised area, prominent from, as it puts it, some localised views.
Yes.
Yeah. And then that this form of development would be out of keeping with the overall character of the village and its landscape setting, and then some policies cited as being breached. That's the matter that you've considered in your evidence, together with the LVAA, which we find in the core documents. And for everyone's reference, it's CD 5.27, C 5.27. We have that. Now, shortly, for the benefit of third parties, I'll ask you to read passages from your summary, but can we just first of all pick up your appendices? The first we find is the assessment of whether or not the site sits within a valued landscape.
Yes.
Which is, as we've indicated, derived from the most recent piece of guidance from your institute, 02/21.
Correct. That's technical guidance note.
Thank you. And your conclusion on that aspect is what, please?
As with the National Planning Policy Framework, also under the criteria set out by the Landscape Institute, the appeal site is not a valued landscape.
Thank you very much indeed. And if we just turn to the conclusions of that document, we see that recorded at 6.1. Can we just look at 6.2, please? In terms of the assessment of its value for LVIA purposes, what is your conclusion?
In terms of value,
Paragraph 6.2.
sorry, I've not got that summary in front of me. As identified within the application LVIA, the landscape value of the site is considered moderate.
Thank you very much indeed. And if we take up, do you remember we were looking at these blue sheets?
Yes.
And I want to look, please, to the second row of the landscape character assessment sheet. where it says LP, and the reading there is medium, can just help us with how we relate medium to the word you used here at 6.2 of moderate.
Well, crudely, high, medium, low, so sort of almost like red, green, amber on a traffic light, is the same as moderate would equate to medium.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Consequently, do we find ourselves within a paragraph 174A test or a paragraph 174B test for the inspector's purposes?
A B test, because we are not a high-valued landscape.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can I then take up the next clip of appendices? So it's called Volume 2, Drawing and Photos. And perhaps the best thing is we just run through it by reference to the large letters on the right-hand side. What you'd like the inspector to draw from this, please.
Yes, I felt it would be helpful, sir, to you and members of the public, rather than dipping between the summary and the visuals, to take a canter through these visuals, not to read every caption or anything, but just to summarize the factual information or the photographs to which I refer. So visual A shows the appeal site and the numbered rights-of-way network, because when we did the comparison table, we included, where Mr. Etchells had referenced a view, we included the relevant footpath. So there is a cross-reference there, and we all know where we're standing. My sheet B, it's just to make the point that the landscape character area, the River Yeo rolling valley farmland, is a massive landscape. I think Mr. Etchells referenced it being 18 kilometres across. So in other words, when we look at our appeal site fields, they are a tiny proportion of that overall landscape character area. And then sheet C, knowing that the village has been identified for potential growth, it's just to make clear that at Wrington, land to the north and to the east is greenbelt, and therefore, if there is to be expansion of the village, it has to go to the south or the west. And presumably that factor was already acknowledged by the council when they identified the village in this context. And then sheet D, sir, important that the key characteristics of the River Yeo Rolling Valley Farmstead LCA, Landscape Character Area, do not include settlements or settlement edges. It's a rural classification, and there is no reference to that landscape character area being influenced by settlement edge. And why that's important is when we come to talk about the landscape character area and the significance of the settlement edge, I say that what is broadly a countryside landscape character area is bound to have a different value out in the open fields and a higher value than where it sits on the edge of settlement, on the edge of modern housing, and which housing therefore does impact on the character of, in this case, the appeal site. And in terms of the identified characteristics of the LCA, that urban edge context downgrades the landscape character area. It's not a classification, it's a characterization, so it's not a value downgrading, but it simply says the appeal site fields do not portray the lead key characteristics unaffected by their urban edge setting.
Thank you.
And then sheets E and F were included from the LVIA and the submission just to show at that time how the development proposal was set out in the context of the village edge. And at F1, perhaps I should just explain, so if it's not clearly evident, I wasn't involved with the application, and when I was asked if I would give evidence for the inquiry, my first answer was, that depends. I need to come and see the site, I need to review the scheme, and only if I believe it's a worthy scheme and an appropriate site will I represent it. And on that plan, on the southern area, I'm just holding up the plan for ease of identification, outside the development area, I felt there was scope for additional planting to assist partly the filtering of views and partly the transition in character from edge of settlement to the wider countryside beyond. And those proposals already within existing landscape framework, so we weren't changing the landscape framework, also support the biodiversity net gain benefits of this proposal. And on sheet G, we simply overlaid the development layout on the wider context of Wrington so you could see how it related to the form and the pattern of both the historic core, but more importantly, the post-war development that we will also look at on sheet J. And then on sheet H, which I trust will be of assistance for the site visit, we've marked the closest two viewpoints on an OS base because we felt where they'd been marked up on the ZVI, they were quite hard to distinguish. And just as a reminder, those include the original LVIA viewpoints, and secondly, the viewpoints that were added in response to the council request. So the completed LVIA was the agreed and combined set of viewpoints that informed the council's review. Mr. Etchells has now chosen to add further viewpoints, which he's entitled to do, but I'm not quite sure what they truly add to the consideration of what were already agreed viewpoints with the council. My sheet I, there's no longer any question about the nature conservation considerations of the site. They are grassland fields, not arable, but they have low biodiversity value. The best hedge on site is the boundary hedge to the road, which will be retained. And so from that, you can see, so we've taken an extract from the ecological report, and which shows the way in which the site has been assessed and the way in which the scheme proposals will deliver a 30.68% increase in biodiversity net gain for habitat and 198.4% increase for hedgerows. Then on my sheet J, which was looked at a moment ago, we have the classification of the housing in terms of historic core and conservation area, and then the post-war context, which is not conservation area, and then the modern context. And I think what's important about that, sir, is that any view from the south over the appeal site, and I know we'll come on to views, is not over historic housing. It's on modern, well, when I say modern, post-Second World War housing. And from the aerial photo, I've counted that up to be about 80 post-war houses that are in between our site and what I believe is a true setting of the church. Then my photos K, L, and M and N were just taken at my first visit in early March, just to add to the, and O, to add to the LVIA photos, and primarily they were given to show the existing character of the village edge on all sides. And so, if I may, I just want to draw to your attention three aspects from photo sheets LM and N. The first aspect, haven't got to the second yet. The first aspect is much of the new housing at Wrington has a very abrupt edge to the wider countryside, and that is illustrated on sheets L, N, and O. And in due course, sir, we will invite you to compare and contrast those existing houses with the quality of landscape framework that has been the leading guide for how the 61 houses are promoted within an enhanced landscape framework. On sheet M, which is not a dissimilar view to one of Mr. Etchell's views, what we have done is taken a wider panorama. No criticism of Mr. Etchell's, but when you look at the photos that we have listed on our table, and so we tried to take a small representative sample from north, south, east, and west, and we wanted to select those that alongside which there was a close comparison already within the LVIA, because otherwise, when we then compared the table, we were never comparing closely similar viewpoints. So that's how those 8 views were selected to be close comparisons to Mr. Etchell's. But the difference is, for instance, and we will look at this in a moment, that sometimes his narrower view leaves off the full extent of the village that is seen from a particular viewpoint, and it therefore focuses on just the edge of village housing rather than the wider housing that exists in those wider photographs. We're nearly at the end. Photo P we'll come on to because it's part of the LVIA assessment. And then I just wanted to draw to the attention of the inquiry the generated view on the front cover. It's a representation, it's not an application drawing, but from this you can best see from this axonometric perspective how the landscape framework, especially along the south, but also up the western side and within the scheme proposals. That's not designed to screen the development, and if you need to screen it, you're probably doing the wrong development in the wrong place. But it's designed to provide a softer edge and filtered views so that the countryside setting in contrast to some of those harsh views that we just looked at in my other photo sheets, the countryside setting is enhanced whilst also providing a higher quality and a better design of new housing. And of course, there is no design challenge to the actual development per se.
Thank you. Can you then just pop those to one side for a second and go within the, you may have it separately, but the core documents I've got, it's CDC 5.28, which is the clip of visualizations. Do you have that?
I don't have it in front of me, so could I just have it from the core documents? I have the wireframes, but not the visualizations. Sorry, what was the number again?
CD 528.
I've got it here because I've got it because I've got the LVIA. Apologies.
Yeah, that's fine. Now, in your volume 3, you have the May 2022 visualizations.
Yes.
This is, so CD 5.28 is the June 21, but there's more of them, which is why
Yes.
I wanted
Yes.
to look at this first. And if you go to the first page of that, you'll find the photo location point.
Yes.
I won't take this way through all of these by any means. I just wanted to pick up a couple. So first of all, can we go to location H? You see on the map, location H. It's the footpath coming down from West Hay Road.
Yes.
And if one travels along that, one gets to view 28 in Mr. Photo 28 in Mr. Etchell's evidence in broad terms. Now, if you flick through, you should find H towards the back of this clip. I have it at figure 2.6a.
Yes, I have that. Sorry, the light's quite dim where I'm sitting, and therefore it's quite hard to see.
And small writing.
Yeah, but I have that, yes.
2.6a. And in the customary way, there's the photo at the top, and then it is manipulated through the subsequent sheets.
Yes.
Yeah. And just help the inspector. This is a direction where the impact is said, at least in visual terms, by Mr. Etchells to be starting high adverse and decreasing over time. Just talk us through how the village sits within the landscape from this perspective, and how the proposal would or indeed wouldn't alter that.
Yeah. Well, this, just for comparison, is Mr. Etchell's photo 26, I believe, but a narrower view. So what you can see here is going from left to right, that you see quite a length and extent of the village. I think
for the note it's 28, actually, on 26.
Sorry, 28. Isn't it? Yes, but this is from the northwest. Sorry,
That's
not
right.
from the west. 28.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I got the wrong photo. So going from left to right, you have quite a long extent of the village, the modern housing on its western edge, the pylon, an unobstructed view through to the church, which won't be affected by the appeal scheme. And then as you come right, you see, as you go over the page, the extent of the development and the benefit of the landscape proposals.
Thank you. Now, the point was made from the other direction about views to the hills, but what hills are we looking at here?
Well, we're looking at the backdrop hills to the east of the appeal site, the AONB.
The AONB, thank you very much. And we can see the village, we can see the tower.
Yes.
And the proposal.
Yeah.
And in terms of, as it were, the balance of the landscape, if I can use that phrase,
Yes.
As perceived from this view, what does the scheme do in respect of that?
Well, 2 points. Firstly, yes, the extent of the village will grow from this point, but it will still be seen in the context of the much larger village to the north. And second point, just as the existing village housing nowhere near comes to the skyline or breaches the views towards the AONB, nor will the appeal scheme.
Thank you very much. Now, can we then go back to the photo sheet and look at location 7?
Yes, so location
7.
7
Yeah.
is due west.
And we can see it's just south of the old railway line.
Yes.
So it's not directly equivalent to Mr. Etchell's 26 and your 6, but
No.
just for the purpose of assisting the inspector, if we go to view 7, which I pick up at figure 2.3a, 2.3a.
Yes.
Yeah. And let's just start with the existing shot first.
Yes.
So how would you characterize those buildings that we can see in white on the top of the slope there?
Those are existing modern housing that do break the skyline.
And in terms of I think the word you used earlier was abrupt existing edge.
Yes.
How would you characterize what the inspector is seeing there?
Well, again, these are abrupt because the edge of the curtilage of the house and its relatively small garden, there is no transition landscape between those dwellings and the wider countryside setting.
Thank you very much. Now, you see the church to the left-hand side of the shot,
Yep.
and the village extending beyond that.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there'll be no interruption of the view to the church.
Thank you very much. And then if we go onto the later sheets,
Yep.
and as the planting goes in, and then as the planting matures, so we get year 1 and year 15,
Yes.
what happens to the settlement edge as a result of the proposals from this perspective?
Well, there's been a slight extension of it, but the benefit over what's there at the moment is there is a strong boundary hedge line with tree planting, which in fact reinstates the historic hedge line that has been lost, and also addresses the point that I'm sure we'll come on to about the Wardle-Armstrong assessment, that their concern about the landscape to the west of the village was that there were no landscape features which could limit development sprawl, whereas what we now see is that there's a strong landscape feature that defines the edge of the development, that enhances the landscape setting, and most definitely provides an edge, a long-term secure boundary.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just while we're in this document, again, just look to the photo viewpoint and location 2. Do you see that?
Yes, I do. That's to the southeast.
That's right. But we're going to go to the up-to-date or updated version, which is your volume 3. Do you have that? Your volume 3,
Yes.
visualizations, May 2022. And if you turn the first page within that part of the appendices, so it's figure 1 to that clip.
Sorry, could you just give me the page reference
Certainly.
again?
I'm not seeing pagination. In your volume 3, you have, after your qualifications experience, you have the tables of effects.
Yes.
And when that finishes, you should have Butts, Batch, Wrington visualizations, May 2022,
Yes.
as a cover page. And then...
And that shows, the air photo shows figure 2.
That's exactly. So you then have location 2 in the aerial photograph. And then again, as before, we have a sequence of photos starting with existing, putting the worked up housing in, and then putting in the planting, so that we eventually end up with, if we go straight on to figure 3.3, the future year position. Yeah?
Yes, and I think what I want to say about that is, as with much of the existing village housing on the edge of the settlement, in fact probably all of it, none of the edge of settlement housing is in any way totally screened or hidden, and why should it be? But in contrast, the appeal scheme brings with it this landscape framework which provides a softening to the new edge of village setting and a better transition to the wider landscape.
Thank you very much. So what I want to do is to compare, in this clip, figure 3.1, which is the existing shot, with figure 3.3, which is the 15 shot.
Yes.
So you can just flick between the two. Now, again, the inspector will recognise winter shot, the hedges have been trimmed, and they're relatively low. We can see by reference to the sign. There'll be a rather different view from location 2 when the inspector goes back on his site visit. But just look at these pictures. We can see in the existing shot the church.
Yes.
and we can see housing, which we know is post-war housing between the church and the viewer.
Yes.
And indeed, such that not all of the church tower is visible. Yeah.
Yes, so as evidenced from the view cones, the adapted layout of the housing was to ensure that post-development you would still have, perhaps from this iconic view arrival to Wrington, that you still had a through view to the church. Obviously not the whole church, because a lot of the modern housing to the south prevents that, but certainly to the upper parts of the church and its tower.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the wooded hill backdrop, again, looking at 3.3, to what extent is that either prevented or obscured the views across the village to that wooded hill backdrop?
The wooded backdrop is fully retained.
And in terms of seeing the church within the context of the village, what is the position there?
Well, this view of the church is retained. I just want to qualify that. It's a winter view. During the summer, as you will have seen yesterday, and we've seen from our own update inspection, both the, not our site's hedgerows, but going right to the back, the existing mature trees preclude any view of the church, as they do from some of the views in the gaps of the permissive footpath.
But how is that situation affected by the appeal proposals?
Well, it's not affected at all, because where there is mature vegetation already there that prevents a summer view, as we see now, then our appeal scheme doesn't alter that.
Thank you very much. And then lastly, in terms of the perception of arriving at a village, we've travelled through the countryside, we've gone over the bridge, we're now approaching the sign that says North Somerset, Wrington, please drive carefully, twinned with ... Between those two photographs, the extent to which that perception is altered to something manifestly different or harmful.
3 points. Clearly, building on a green field changes the immediate character of that field, but in terms of arrival to the village, seeing the new housing, but within its landscape setting, it is an enhanced, softened view to the arrival than the starker view of the existing modern houses, which don't benefit from such softening. And I think the character of the views to the church, the character of the hills, the character of the housing, which is the design and working with the design review panel, sympathetic materials, attractive design, mixture of materials. I'm going to be bold and say that's a lot better than a lot of the post-war housing that exists, and therefore we are proud of and take credit for that better quality of design for an edge of village setting.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we leave that point, how does that accord or otherwise with the government's agenda, what's called the beauty agenda,
yes,
which we now find in section 13 of the MPPF?
Yes, well, I went through the government criteria in my proof, and in my main evidence, I set out how we answer each and every point of the government's expectation for higher quality design and design of better appearance.
Thank you very much. Well, with that in mind, would you mind going back to your main proof? Because we'll find the reason for refusal there set out at 1.6.
I'm still remembering I haven't read my summary yet.
No, I know. And we'll just identify your views in respect to the various allegations made. Do you have that 1.6?
I do.
Reason 2. Firstly, whether you can agree that the appeal site itself is in a location highly sensitive to change. Do you?
No, I don't agree with that.
And the reason for that is?
The reason is that the key characteristics of the landscape character area, which we looked at earlier on my plan, are not unaffected by the existing edge of village setting. And therefore, to have, if I use the word pristine landscape from that landscape character area, it cannot sit next to modern post-war development that is clearly not in keeping with its character, without there being some sort of softening or mitigation to allow new development to sit well in the countryside setting.
Can I just interrupt? My apologies, just to make sure I've understood you correctly. You said they are not unaffected. Your words, they are not unaffected. They are not unaffected. Possibly a double negative. Does that mean they are affected?
Yes.
Good.
So in other words, those...
Well, not good, but good I've understood you
those
correctly.
fields, if we move them 500 yards to the west, they would be...
It was just the English I wanted to make sure I'd understood.
Yes.
I've got the point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the quality of those fields is affected by the relationship they have with the existing edge of settlement.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then in terms of the entrance to Wrington village along Half Yard, you've already indicated, as far as you're concerned, there will be a better sense of arrival compared with the existing.
Yes, I believe so, because instead of seeing houses that have no framework other than perhaps a low garden hedge, the arrival will benefit from the trees planted, the habitat setting, the new hedgerows which are put in place on the site of lost historic hedgerows along the southern and western boundary. So in fact, in terms of landscape heritage, we are helping to recreate what has been lost and then to fit in within that setting high quality housing, which in fact, of course, has been in review accorded an award, which we'll come on to.
Thank you very much. It says in scale in excess of that supported by CS32 as part of the hierarchical approach to settlements. Mr. Lee, are you able to assist us whether you understand CS32 to set a numerical limit on development at service villages?
No, per se it doesn't. It indicates a sort of approximate, you might say, target figure of around 25, unless brought forward through a local plan or other review. But of course, and I'm not the planner, so don't shoot me if I get this wrong, but as I understand it, in the absence of a robust 5-year land supply, there is far more imperative to deliver houses to make good the shortfall. And if you do it in a village that's already been identified for housing, and if you do it in a way that can benefit from restoring lost landscape features and providing an enhanced framework, then you are delivering sustainable development, in my view.
Thank you. And if the scheme were indeed part of a neighbourhood plan allocation, does CS32 limit the total scale of that?
No.
Thank you very much. And this would substantially alter an attractive open countryside to urbanised area prominent from some localised views. What's your view on that?
Well, from close to views, there are, of course, changes. There's not a development in the land where that isn't the case. It's been acknowledged from more distant views and the AONB setting, there's no adverse impact of any significance. And where there would be adverse impact without appropriate landscape planting and mitigation, that has been taken care of within the landscape-led framework for this development.
Thank you. And consequently, your view whether or not the scheme is out of keeping with the overall character and village and its landscape setting?
No, I don't believe it is. And I think I just want to hold up again that drawing in my volume 2. It's sheet J, sir, because this references the form and the pattern of the village. And from that sheet, you can see, with virtual post-war development on all sides of the village, almost enveloping it completely, we continue the form and the pattern of village expansion over the last 70 years.
Thank you. There's just a couple of points I want your assistance with, please, in terms of Mr. Etchell's evidence. Do you remember he went to a series, not all of them by any means, but a series of his photos in his evidence in chief? I wonder if you could just take up his appendices for me.
Yes, I made a list of his viewpoints, which he took us to in chief, which were 1, 2, 16, 19, 20, and 21.
Mm-hmm. You have that clip with you. They're all in his appendices to his proof.
Could you just give me a moment?
Yeah.
Please? Yes, I have them.
Got it? Let's deal with 1 and 2 together, first of all. You should have them just on adjacent pages.
Yes.
So 1 looking from across the river through one of the intermittent gaps. 2 is our familiar 2.
Yes.
Okay?
I just wanted to comment on 1 because it was suggested that where there's a gap in a hedge line, a walker would stop and admire the view. But as you will have found when you're walking either westwards from the road or eastwards back, the lovely countryside view is not the sideways view looking back to Wrington. It's down the alignment of the footpath, on which there will be no changes, and that is your normal view. In fact, in order to really appreciate the view through the gap in the hedge, you probably have to turn completely sideways, and I think, as in this case, step forward off the alignment of the footpath to get a bit closer to the gap in the hedge line, which, of course, now in summer is much shut down and with no view of the church because of the vegetation.
Okay. Actually, it's 2 and 16 which sit together, isn't it? Because they're just a little bit further along the road near the signpost,
Yes.
the entrance sign.
I mean, Mr. Etchells was honest enough to say he hasn't been back to site, so he won't be aware that the hedge has grown up and this view doesn't exist because of the growth of the hedges, which will all be maintained because the site access points are established, and the background vegetation in front of the church, beyond the paddock, is already screening the church in any case.
There was a suggestion, though, that the views of the church and also the views of the hills behind would be obscured. Given what we've just been through in terms of the other documents, what do you say to that?
Well, no, the views won't be obscured. I made a note that in chief, Mr. Etchell said it's not an appropriate area development on account of 4 matters. His first was views, which we've addressed. The second was the church. Well, in winter we maintain the through view. In summer there isn't a view. His third was the hills, and we simply don't block or change views to the hills in any direction. And his fourth was the approach, by which I believe he meant arriving from the south and the roadway or the pedestrian walkway. And in a way, that's the same as views, because those were some of his critical close-up views that he said were unacceptable in terms of the development and change to the character of the edge of village.
Thank you. And then if we take 19, 20 and 21 together, how would the proposals material to that experience?
Well, 20 and 21 we can take together because they're part of the continuum journey arriving from the south. Again, in summer, those views are much more restricted. and probably without views of the site in the main. And then 19, that view north towards the site from further to the west, there will be no change to the views of the church or the hills.
Yeah. Thank you. Second point from Mr. Etch was to do with the concept of filtered views. Remember, he had a particular reference to your evidence.
Yes.
Just respond to that in terms of what you understand filtering to be seeking to achieve.
What filtering achieves is that it prevents a harsh edge of development, in a way quite brutal. You're at the edge of the development and then you're into the countryside and there's no softening. So although we don't aim to screen the development, by the planting that's included along the reinstated hedgerows and in the land to the south, tree planting and hedgerow planting, we still retain glimpsed views through, but those views are filtered so that at no time do you see an unrelieved view of the whole development. You may get glimpses through to certain houses or quite a few houses, but the benefit of those is that the views are not unrelieved and benefit from the hedgerow and tree framework, even in winter, because the quantum of trees, the branches, the twigs still provide a filter rather than an unrelieved, harsh view.
Thank you. Next point was to do with your different assessment of sensitivity of the landscape. And we might also wrap in the Wardle Armstrong point at the same time. So how have you gone about assessing sensitivity of the landscape, particularly in terms of the land to the west and south of the village?
Yes. I mean, when I first was involved, I reviewed the overall LVIA work that had been done by colleagues in the landscape practice, and I could see that it was a very thorough document. It had benefited from consultation and review with the council so that all of the viewpoints were agreed. And then, for the reasons I've given already, my own assessment, based on my professional expert view, is that the character of the site is affected by its edge of village setting, and therefore that downgrades it somewhat, not massively, but somewhat, from if those fields were out in open countryside, away from any settlement influences. And then for viewpoints, of course, on day one, there will be more impact of views, but we take a medium-term view of new development, and that's why we'll look at year 1, year 5, year 15, and what we've done here is we've looked at implementation and then at year 15, which I think is a fair enough way to assess a development settling in to its edge of village setting, and therefore I don't believe the site is as sensitive as has been made out. The starting point for the sensitivity was Wardle Armstrong saying, in the absence of any landscape features that could potentially limit development, and then their words were, owing to this and other matters, the land is of high sensitivity. But our development ensures that there are landscape features which will prevent unrestricted spread of development, unless subject to further planning submissions and approval in the future. And therefore, because of that, the sensitivity, I say, is not high.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I then take you to the summary and conclusions of your section 7? Well, I won't ask you to read all of this. I just want you to read, if you wouldn't mind, select passages for the benefit of third parties. 7.3 might be a good place to start.
Yeah. Within section 2 of my proof, I refer to the very thorough presentation document progressed for the Design West Review panel held on the 20th of April. I give the CD number. And following this, the 5th of May 2021 Design West written response included points or suggestions on which I have commented at my proof, section 2.2. And because I felt it was such a good illustrative figure, I took the unusual step of putting a single extract page from that design review submission in my main proof. And that's on my page 19. And so you will have seen it's the concept drawing and the way in which the landscape framework prescribed how the development should be set out, both within the context of the renewed hedgerows and for the internal landscape framework. So this is very much a landscape-led submission.
Just the bullet points that follow. So you're at 7.3.
Yeah, and I in particular drew attention to, firstly, relating proposals to the building with nature standard, which has resulted in an award being made for the Butts batch proposal. And in CD D5, so you will see the way in which that building with nature standard has reviewed the scheme proposals and then confirmed compliance. Secondly, for tree groups and tree species, more information was requested, which was subsequently included within the update application details. Thirdly, planting on the western boundary was noted as a positive, but not for the purpose of hiding the development, and indeed retained through views to the All Saints Church were requested as now incorporated fully within the scheme layout. And then fourthly, requests for the landscape strategy to become bolder and more specific, making a distinct contribution to character. And I believe we've now pointed this out more firmly, and you see that within the enhanced landscape framework. And then finally, the landscape strategy and the strategy for social interactivity, the panel asked for this to be demonstrated in clear diagrams that highlight their distinct role in the layout, and that is shown in the updated DRP drawings.
Thank you. Can you then just skip over to 7.11? And if you wouldn't mind reading 7.11, 12 and 13.
So, under the heading of Landscape Character and Visual Impact Assessment, with cross-reference to the October 2020 LVIA produced by the Land Map Practice, I have extracted the photo viewed points contained within Figure 6, which we've looked at, and these are shown on Plan H on the OS base. The LVIA document provides a very detailed review and analysis of both distant and close-to views to the site. Major adverse visual effects were only identified from limited close-to viewpoints, but otherwise the majority of visual effects are minor or negligible. And I tabulated those in my Appendix 2 from the whole LVIA. As noted from the DRP presentation, the extract context on connectivity sheet, which I've highlighted, shows the capacity and credentials of the appeal site for sustainable development and how this would be achieved through placemaking. And then I list these 6 factors of placemaking, which I may not need to read out.
Yeah.
Does it help you, sir, or not?
I think bearing in mind the purpose of what we're doing and primarily for interested parties, I think it would be helpful. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So the factors of placemaking are providing the provision of high-quality sustainable homes, tick, easy and sustainable access to public transport, yes, walking and cycling, recreation and socializing, respecting the wildlife context, and provision of an improved edge to the village. And I think under the respecting the wildlife context, I'd just like to qualify that the wildlife value of the site is low, as shown from the ecological surveys, and in fact is significantly enhanced in terms of the biodiversity net gain figures. And then the strategic priorities were firstly the importance of the green infrastructure, which of course is provided within the site layout, to create employment opportunities. Well, a residential scheme can only do that during the construction phase, development of a diverse community, promotion of health and well-being, close linkages to a range of local services, and supporting priority habitats. So all of those form part of the design review panel document.
And 7.13?
The capacity of the site for development was therefore identified following both a baseline environmental review and taking account of specific opportunities and constraints applying to the site. These were all shown on the landscape consideration sheet within the DRP and with the summary text as covered in my paragraph 4.20, covering the following points. Gently undulating field bounded and bisected by hedgerows, western and southern boundaries open to the agricultural land, adjacent to the existing settlement edge of Wrington, connections to the rural landscape to the west, south and north, strongly tree lines which follow the River Yeo along the base of the valley, respecting the residential amenity green boundary treatment, defining the western and southern boundary new hedgerows and tree planting, built and rural transition between, located POS on the western site boundary, the southern approach to Wrington providing a green gateway and tree planting which maintains selected sight lines to the All Saints Church, respecting local distinctiveness and respecting views to All Saints Church from both within the site and the surrounding area, and finally blending with the settlement context in consideration of form, height, massing and design with two-storey maximum development, including views from the public right-of-way network.
Thank you very much. I think, given what we've already covered, you can probably skip directly to the conclusions at 7.23 and 24, please.
I'm just going to take a sip of water.
Yes, of course.
So these are my overall conclusions. Firstly, the appeal site has evident capacity for the number of dwellings proposed without causing harm to landscape or environmental factors on the edge of village site that has been identified. And can I just clarify, it's a village that's been identified as suitable for expansion. As identified within the submitted LVIA, the appeal site landscape is of moderate value and with no designations or landscape quality with a presumption against development. Secondly, the proposed landscape-led scheme provides a high-quality green framework for the proposed housing. This will enhance the appearance of the existing settlement edge and provide an appropriate green transition to the wider open countryside to the south and west. Biodiversity enhancement will deliver a significant 30.68% net gain for habitats and 198.4% for hedgerows. A high-quality delivery of 61 new dwellings, including 18 affordable homes, is within the Wrington settlement identified as a service village where suitable and well-designed development is within the supporting context of applicable policies. In my professional opinion, therefore, there are no site-specific policy, environmental or design reasons why the appeal scheme should not be granted consent. The proposals are a positive way to deliver much-needed high-quality and sustainable homes within a highly attractive landscape setting, and the landscape proposals for the site have also passed the Building with Nature audit and awarded accreditation as a national benchmark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. Is there anything else you want to add at this stage?
I think that's enough.
Lovely. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lier. We'll adjourn very shortly. A few logistical points and sort of housekeeping points for tomorrow. Obviously, it's always a bit of an effort to relocate. I don't underestimate that, but it's a worthwhile exercise. I've no doubt about that. So we're resuming at 9:30 tomorrow. So if everybody can endeavour to get there good and early. I don't know this venue. I'm sure Wringtonians are very familiar with it. Are there any tips, any words of advice that you can offer those of us who are new to the Memorial Hall?
So before you deal with that, I was going to observe that from what we understand, a good many of the Wringtonians, if you like, because of the pre-inquiry note and so on, are assuming that it's 10 o'clock.
Ah, did the pre-inquiry note say 10 o'clock?
It did.
Right. Oh, well, that's. I think on that basis, we ought to shuffle it back to 10 o'clock. Such is my enthusiasm to get on with things. But we'll thank you for that interjection. We will stick with 10 then. Let's give us an extra half an hour to get ourselves organised. Thank you for that word. We're well on with the evidence, so that's the loss of half an hour is not a point of concern, I don't think. But yeah, are there any words of advice you can offer us, or is it just a case of park up and unload and find one's space?
There is parking. It's small. The car park is small, but we have asked if elderly people are coming that somebody can try and drop them rather than having to walk, so that there's parking spaces for people that are coming into the village. So hopefully that will help.
Yeah, we
can't guarantee that, of course, because people will always do their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, if a bit of space could be, I don't know, I wouldn't literally say cordoned off in a literal sense, but
we can try. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, we could cordon off a couple of spaces, or maybe 3 spaces, so there's enough space for. Well, would that be enough?
I think that, from my point of view, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of others, if there were 3 spaces, that I am now talking in literal terms, because I think you made the offer. That would be really very much appreciated, and then we've got the certainty.
There's certainly enough space to unload stuff, but it's just, there will be enough space. We'll sort it out. All right.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to turn my mic on and off. Thank you. That would be appreciated. In terms of plugging devices in and that kind of thing, this is a leading question, because there's a lot of core documents, and if I can get away with having the core documents moved, and it's worked quite well today. I've been able to get all the core documents and material predominantly on my laptop, and if I can do that again tomorrow, that would be ideal. I suppose my point is, will I be able to plug this into a source of electricity, and is the Wi-Fi stable?
We understand that the Wi-Fi is working, and it certainly worked when I last used it. That's the first thing. There are plug points, and we've checked on that. And the other thing is the parish council offices are literally they're in that same area. So if you're really stuck, we can go to them for help.
Excellent, that sounds very helpful. What I don't have is, which is remiss of me, I don't have an extension lead. So if there's one other venue, I'd really appreciate that, please. Thank you. Okay. Anything else about the venue or the housekeeping points?
Do you mind, just a sense of timings for tomorrow? There's been some discussion outside the inquiry, but I wonder if there's any more information in terms of how long we're likely to be spending with the Wrington witnesses, as it were. So my understanding is that Thursday is given over to the choir witnesses, and it's Wednesday, starting at 10 now, that we have other non-choir witnesses coming forward to give evidence. But what I don't have a feel for is how many or how long, and therefore what the programme is for the rest of the day in terms of the 2 witnesses, appellants landscape and local authority heritage. I don't know if Mr. Storer can help.
So sorry, I perhaps got hold of the wrong end of the stick. You're talking about tomorrow and the sort of interested parties. But yeah, it's difficult to know. I've got confirmation, and I don't have my note here actually, but it's off the top of my head about in the region of 10 with possibly more that I think largely come via the case officer, via Mr. Storer. But of course, one doesn't know until the day. Of course, Keep Wrington as Wrington are representing at least some of the community, so that they may be comfortable with that as representing their views and other people speaking. He obviously had a lot of representations too, and people may well be content with their written. But are you able to cast any more light on likely numbers, Mr. Storer?
No, sir. The people have indicated, you say, about 10 is probably an accurate figure that we have, but obviously there are people who may well have it in mind to speak and just haven't made it clear to us, and there are probably others who may intend to speak and then hear something said already that they don't need to repeat, so it is difficult to quantify that number.
Okay, that's helpful. Just one final point on that. The last I heard was some representative of the parish council would like to come, but the original, the person who was originally intending to do it wasn't available. Do we know if somebody else has been identified yet?
No. What's happened is that the person who was intending on speaking is actually on holidays. It was a pre-booked holiday, and then the person who was supporting that also had a pre-booked holiday, and they hadn't realised the dates at the time. The others are generally working, but my understanding is that Steve Hogg, our local councillor, may actually help with that representation.
Okay, that's helpful. I think it is just a case of us having to see what happens really in terms of numbers and progress things from there.
It sounds, though, I think it's not unreasonable to say, it sounds that we'll comfortably finish those representations within a couple of hours. So, you know, if everyone takes 5 minutes, it's an hour. If everyone takes 10 minutes, then it's 2 hours. If we start at 10, therefore by 12, that part of the exercise will be concluded. And then Fran cross-examines my landscape witness, and I think the indication was again about an hour and a half. So by early afternoon, let's say, we will be on to Dr. Hudson Macaulay, in which case I'm assuming you'd like me to then carry on and cross-examine her that afternoon rather than delay her into Thursday.
Ideally,
Yeah.
it depends somewhat on timing, but all being well, that was what my hope was, but we'll see.
I mean, I'm very happy to, as always, to play things by ear, just in terms of getting my own head around things. I'll assume for the present purposes that I will be cross-examining Dr. Hudson Macaulay tomorrow afternoon. It may be it slips into Thursday, but we'd obviously try and finish her within the day.
Yeah, that's my preference, to have witnesses, not leave witnesses dangling overnight, but we'll see how we get on. Okay.
So am I allowed to speak?
Well, if you'd like to say something, please do.
I was just going to ask, is there no possibility of my continuing straight away in the morning while sort of the flow is there? I'm conscious that if there's a long interruption, and I know third parties sometimes can take longer and longer and the numbers grow, and I would really be somewhat upset if my evidence went into a third day because of the locals taking that long.
I don't think there's any danger of that happening.
Okay. But we can't start with me, is that the decision?
My inclination is not to start with you, so that if there was anything that came out of what was said, that the appellant's evidence, witnesses could pick that up, and potentially, I'm not really inviting this because I'm not really sure there's anything new that's likely to be picked up, but I'd rather have that contingency personally, and I just don't foresee. I mean, that's famous last words, isn't it? But I don't foresee things being very, very long. Obviously, we do want to hear from people, and it's important that they are heard. So, we won't be rushing things, but equally, based on my feel for numbers, I'm hopeful we'll be wrapped up in the morning, and we'll return to you. And I don't foresee any issue with your evidence being completed tomorrow at all. Yeah, not ideal from your point of view, I appreciate, but I just think it's a better overall approach. No, you're not. Absolutely, you're not. No. Okay. We'll, unless there is anything that can't wait until tomorrow, we'll draw stumps now and resume tomorrow in Wrington at 10 o'clock. Thank you all.